The moment Kylie Barnes told the man in seat 2A to move to the back of the plane, she had no idea she'd just humiliated her own boss. Damian Cross didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply asked for her employee ID number, collected business cards from everyone involved, and walked to economy class while a travel blogger's livestream turned the entire incident into a viral firestorm. By the time Flight 447 touched down in Los Angeles, 3 million people had watched a CEO get racially profiled on his own airline. And now, with cameras still rolling, he was about to show them exactly what accountability looked like when the person you discriminated against signs your paycheck. If you're watching from around the world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe accountability matters, hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens next will restore your faith. That justice isn't just possible. It's inevitable when the right person refuses to stay silent. The November sky stretched endless and cold beyond the terminal windows at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, a pale gray canvas that mirrored the exhaustion etched into the faces of business travelers waiting at gate K7. Damian Cross stood near the window, one hand wrapped around a paper cup of black coffee that had long since gone lukewarm, his reflection ghosting against the glass. He was 42 years old, 6'1", with close-cropped hair going distinguished at the temples and a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of boardrooms and quarterly earnings calls. His posture was relaxed but attentive, the bearing of someone who'd learned long ago that the world watched black men differently, measured them by harsher metrics, and that composure was both armor and weapon. Behind him, Gate K7 hummed with the familiar chaos of pre-boarding, overhead announcements crackling through ancient speakers, children whining about snacks, business travelers frantically typing last-minute emails on phones and tablets. Damian had made this trip between Chicago and Los Angeles 63 times in the past 2 years. He'd stopped counting after that, the rhythm of wheels up and wheels down becoming just another heartbeat in the pulse of running a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. The Crosswell Group had started 12 years ago in a converted warehouse space in Detroit, just Damian and 2 college friends with more ambition than capital, building financial models on secondhand computers and pitching venture deals to anyone who'd take a meeting. Now they managed $18 billion in assets across 7 countries, with a reputation for turning struggling companies into industry leaders. Damian's specialty was operational turnarounds, identifying structural inefficiencies, rebuilding corporate cultures, and when necessary, wielding the kind of strategic pressure that brought executives to negotiating tables they'd previously ignored. 3 months ago, the Crosswell Group had completed its largest acquisition yet, a controlling stake in Transcontinental Airways, the 5th largest carrier in North America. The airline had been hemorrhaging money for years, plagued by aging aircraft, outdated service models, and a corporate culture that seemed designed to drive away both customers and quality employees. Damian had seen potential where others saw a sinking ship, not just in the balance sheets, but in the thousands of workers who showed up every day despite management that didn't value them, passengers who deserved better than cattle car treatment, and routes that still served communities the bigger carriers had abandoned. The board had been skeptical. Transportation wasn't their usual sector. Airlines were notoriously difficult to run profitably, caught between razor-thin margins, volatile fuel costs, and unions with legitimate grievances against decades of mismanagement. But Damian had built his career on calculated risks, on seeing patterns where others saw chaos, and the data had been unambiguous. Transcontinental wasn't failing because air travel was unprofitable. It was failing because leadership had stopped caring about the fundamentals, treating people with dignity, delivering consistent service, and understanding that employees who felt valued created customers who felt the same way. So they'd done it. The Crosswell Group now held 58% ownership of Transcontinental Airways, making Damian Cross not just a major shareholder, but the de facto boss of every pilot, flight attendant, mechanic, and gate agent who wore the airline's uniform. He'd spent the last quarter meeting with union representatives, touring maintenance facilities, sitting in on training sessions, and flying coach on random routes to experience what customers actually experienced, not the sanitized version executives saw on carefully staged inspection tours. Today's flight was supposed to be different. Damian had meetings in Los Angeles with the airline's senior leadership team, presentations to review, merger documents that needed signing. His assistant had booked him in first class, seat 2A, the window seat that gave him space to work and think without interruption. After a 14-hour day of back-to-back negotiations in Chicago, he'd earned the quiet and the legroom. Now boarding Flight 447 with service to Los Angeles, the gate agent announced, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who'd said those words 10,000 times. We'll begin with our first-class passengers and those needing extra time. Damien gathered his belongings, leather messenger bag stuffed with contracts and financial reports, noise-canceling headphones, the coffee he'd finally admitted was undrinkable, and joined the short line of first-class passengers moving toward the jetway. Ahead of him, a woman in expensive athleisure wear juggled a designer purse and a phone call about someone's failed Botox appointment. Behind him, a tech bro type in a hoodie and $1,000 sneakers complained loudly about conference schedules. The jetway smelled of jet fuel and industrial carpet cleaner, that distinctive airport scent that somehow existed identically in every terminal across the globe. Damien's shoes echoed on the metal floor as he descended toward the aircraft, already mentally organizing the work he'd tackle once airborne. The Henderson acquisition needed final review, the quarterly investors' report required his approval, and he wanted to draft talking points for tomorrow's leadership meeting before they landed. He stepped through the aircraft door into the first-class cabin, immediately noting the details he'd trained himself to observe. Overhead bins already half full from early boarders gaming the system. The faint smell of cleaning solution not quite masking stale air. Seats that showed wear despite being advertised as premium leather. The cabin was configured with 12 first-class seats in a 1-2-1 layout, the kind that converted to lie-flat beds and cost 3 times the economy fare. Seat 2A was on the left side, just behind the cockpit door. Damien slid his messenger bag under the seat in front of him. He liked keeping important documents within reach rather than in the overhead, and settled into the leather seat that had molded to the shapes of countless previous occupants. He pulled out his laptop, opened the Henderson file, and was 3 paragraphs into the executive summary when a voice interrupted his concentration. "Excuse me, sir." Damien looked up. The flight attendant standing in the aisle was young, maybe late 20s, with blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name tag read Kylie Barnes, and everything about her posture, the tight shoulders, the forced brightness in her voice, suggested she viewed this job as a stepping stone to something better rather than a career she valued. "Yes?" Damien said, keeping his tone neutral, professional. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need you to move to economy class." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that for a moment Damien thought he'd misheard. Around them, the boarding process continued, passengers shuffling past in the aisle, overhead bins slamming shut, the ambient noise of an airplane preparing for departure. "I'm sorry?" Damien said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all, merely giving her a chance to correct what had to be a mistake. Kylie's smile tightened. "We have a Platinum Elite member who needs this seat. Airline policy gives priority to our highest-tier frequent flyers, and since you're traveling on a standard first-class ticket, you'll need to relocate to economy." Damien's expression didn't change, but something cold and analytical clicked into place behind his eyes. The same focus he brought to hostile negotiations. The ability to observe and process while keeping emotions locked behind a professional veneer. "I purchased this seat," he said, his voice measured and calm. "It's assigned to me on my boarding pass. Unless there's a mechanical issue or a safety concern, I don't understand the basis for asking me to move." "It's company policy," Kylie repeated, her tone sharpening with impatience. "Our Platinum members receive priority seating, and we need to accommodate—" "What's the Platinum member's name?" Damien interrupted, still calm but now with an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. "And can you show me where in the airline's contract of carriage it states that passengers can be removed from confirmed paid seats to accommodate loyalty status?" Kylie's jaw tightened. This wasn't going the way these conversations usually went. Most passengers, when confronted by authority in a uniform, complied. They might complain, might demand to speak to supervisors later, but they moved. This man in seat 2A wasn't moving, and something about his quiet confidence, his refusal to be flustered or intimidated, clearly unsettled her. "Sir, I don't appreciate your attitude. If you refuse to comply with crew instructions, that's a federal violation, and I can have you removed from this flight entirely. It was, Damien reflected later, the moment when a minor customer service failure became something far more significant. Not because of what she said, he'd heard worse, faced down more substantive threats in boardrooms where billions hung in the balance, but because of how she said it, the undertone that suggested she expected compliance simply because she'd demanded it, and the implicit threat that framed his reasonable questions as insubordination. I'm asking about policy, Damien said, his voice never rising above conversational volume, not challenging your authority. I'd like to understand the specific regulation that allows an airline to remove a passenger from a confirmed seat without compensation to accommodate another passenger's loyalty status. If you can show me that policy, I'll be happy to review it. In the row across the aisle, a young Asian woman with bright purple highlights and a phone already in her hand had been half listening to the exchange while pretending to scroll through social media. Mina Park was a travel blogger with 200,000 YouTube subscribers who followed her adventures through airlines, hotels, and hidden gems in cities most influencers ignored. She had a nose for content, an instinct for when ordinary travel frustrations crossed the line into something her audience would care about, and every alarm in her content creator brain was currently screaming that what was unfolding in Seat 2A was exactly that kind of moment. She opened her livestream app, angled her phone camera to capture both Damien and the flight attendant, and tapped the button to go live. Within seconds, viewers started joining, 12, 47, 93, the counter climbing as her regular audience received notifications and clicked through to see what was happening. Hey everyone, Mina whispered into her phone, her voice low enough not to disrupt but clear enough for her microphone to catch. We've got a situation developing on my Chicago to LA flight. A black passenger in first class is being told to move to economy to make room for someone else. I'm going to document this because something feels really wrong here. Kylie, noticing the phone aimed in her direction, straightened to her full height, which was several inches shorter than Damien even when he was seated. Ma'am, you need to put that phone away. Recording crew members without permission violates airline policy. Actually, Mina said, her voice friendly but firm, I'm in a public space, and I have every right to document what's happening, but I'm happy to focus on my own seat area if you'd prefer. She didn't lower the phone. Her viewer count had hit 300 and was climbing fast. Kylie's face flushed. This was spiraling out of her control. These passengers were refusing to simply do what they were told, and somewhere in her training she'd been taught that authority asserted firmly enough would bring compliance. Sir, she said, turning back to Damien, if you don't move to economy immediately, I'm calling the captain, and you will be removed from this aircraft. Damien reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, moving with the same unhurried calm he'd maintained since the conversation began. Before this goes any further, he said, I'd like to document this interaction as well. May I have your full name and employee identification number? Kylie blinked, clearly not expecting this response. What? Your full name and employee ID number, Damien repeated, already opening the Notes app on his phone. And the name of your supervisor. Since you're threatening to have me removed from a flight for asking about policy, I want to make sure I have the correct information when I file a formal complaint with the airline. You can't, Kylie started, then stopped, clearly uncertain of her ground. Passengers weren't supposed to ask for that information. They were supposed to comply or escalate to supervisors themselves, not treat the interaction like a deposition. I absolutely can, Damien said, his tone still perfectly courteous, the words of someone who'd read a lot of corporate policy manuals and knew exactly where the lines were drawn. Federal regulations require airline employees to identify themselves when asked by passengers. So again, name and employee ID, please. Kylie's hand moved to the call button on the wall panel, and moments later another flight attendant appeared from the galley. This one was older, maybe 45, with silver threading through his dark hair and the bearing of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to have seen everything. His name tag identified him as Gavin Hart, and he wore the extra stripe on his uniform that marked him as a senior attendant. What seems to be the problem? Gavin asked, his tone suggesting he'd already decided whose side he was on before hearing the details. This passenger is refusing to move to accommodate a Platinum Elite member, Kylie explained, her voice carrying a note of vindication, as if Gavin's presence proved she'd been right all along. and he's being argumentative and recording our conversation. Gavin turned to look at Damien, and something flickered across his face. An expression too quick to fully parse, but that landed somewhere between surprise and calculation. He glanced at the seat number, at Damien's face, at the expensive suit, and the laptop showing financial documents, and Damien could almost see him doing the same mental math every black professional had learned to recognize, the assessment of whether someone belonged in a space, the unconscious recalibration of expectations based on skin color. "Sir," Gavin said, his voice carrying the false patience of someone addressing a child or a subordinate, "we need this seat for one of our most valuable customers. I'm sure you understand that our elite members receive certain accommodations as part of their loyalty benefits. We'll be happy to refund the difference in fare between first class and economy, but we do need you to relocate." "Has anyone explained which policy allows you to remove a passenger from a confirmed seat?" Damien asked, addressing Gavin with the same calm professionalism. "Ms. Barnes mentioned it was company policy, but I'd like to see it in writing. The contract of carriage I read when I purchased this ticket didn't include provisions for involuntary seat reassignment based on another passenger's loyalty status." Gavin's jaw tightened. "Sir, I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," Damien interrupted, his voice still level but now carrying unmistakable steel. "A flight attendant has demanded I move from a seat I paid for, threatened me with removal when I asked about the policy basis for that demand, and now you've been called in to reinforce that demand. What I don't understand is why this is happening, because nothing in the airline's published policies supports what you're asking me to do." The boarding process had slowed to a trickle, passengers in the aisle now openly watching the confrontation, phones appearing in hands, the energy in the cabin shifting from routine pre-flight irritation to something more charged. Mina's live stream had accumulated over 1,000 viewers, comments flooding her screen. "This is racial profiling, straight up. I fly this airline and this is not their policy. Someone get this man's name. He's about to sue them into next century. Why are they doing this? He clearly belongs in first class." Gavin lowered his voice, leaning slightly closer, apparently believing that a more intimate approach might yield better results. "Sir, I'm trying to help you here. The passenger who needs this seat is Clayton Reed. He's one of our Platinum Elite members, and he's also a senior executive with one of the airline's corporate partners. This isn't about race or anything like that. It's just business, and I'm sure you can appreciate that we need to maintain good relationships with our most important customers." The statement hung in the air, remarkable both for what it said and what it revealed. Damien filed away the name, Clayton Reed, and the implicit admission that loyalty status and corporate connections were being used to justify removing a paying passenger from a confirmed seat. He also noted the defensive, "this isn't about race" comment, unprompted, which experienced discrimination told him usually meant it was absolutely about race. "Mr. Hart," Damien said, reading the name tag and committing it to memory alongside Kylie Barnes's information, "I'd like your employee ID number as well. And I want to be very clear about something. I am not moving from this seat unless you can show me a written policy that authorizes this request, or unless the captain personally orders me to move for a safety reason. If you attempt to remove me without that justification, you'll be opening this airline to a lawsuit that will cost significantly more than whatever goodwill you're trying to maintain with Mr. Reed." Gavin's face hardened. "Sir, you're being disruptive. If you continue to refuse crew instructions, I will call airport security and have you removed." "Please do," Damien said calmly. "I'd like as much documentation of this incident as possible. And while you're at it, could you also notify the captain that you're removing a passenger solely because another passenger with higher loyalty status wants his seat? I'm curious to hear what the pilot thinks of that justification." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then Gavin straightened, his expression tight with anger barely held in check, and moved toward the cockpit door. Kylie remained in the aisle, her face flushed, arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture. She glanced at Damien, at Mina still recording across the aisle, at the other first-class passengers now openly staring, and seemed to realize too late that this situation had escaped her control. A commotion near the aircraft door drew everyone's attention. A heavy-set white man in his 50s had entered first class, moving with the presumptive confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening at his approach. He wore an expensive suit with the rumpled casualness of someone who traveled constantly and had stopped caring about appearances. And he was followed by a younger woman in her 30s carrying a briefcase and typing on a phone simultaneously. "There's been some confusion about my seat," the man announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who expected problems to evaporate when he named them. "I'm Clayton Reed, Platinum Elite, and I need seat 2A for medical reasons. My assistant has documentation if anyone requires it." He looked directly at Damien, his gaze traveling from face to suit to the laptop showing financial documents, and something dismissive flickered across his features. "I'm sure we can find you a comfortable spot in economy," Clayton said, his tone suggesting this was a generous offer rather than an insult. "Coach isn't so bad these days. You'll manage." The condescension in those words, "you'll manage," landed like a physical blow, carrying layers of assumption about who belonged where, who deserved comfort, and who should be grateful for accommodation. Damien felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, the rage that came from 1,000 similar moments across his life. Being followed in department stores, having colleagues assume he was IT support instead of the executive leading the meeting, watching white competitors be given opportunities he had to fight twice as hard to earn. But he'd learned long ago that anger, however justified, was a tool to be controlled rather than a fire to be unleashed. So he took a slow breath, met Clayton Reed's eyes, and said simply, "I purchased this seat. It's assigned to me, and no one has provided any valid reason why I should give it up." Clayton's expression hardened. "I just told you, medical reasons. I have a documented condition that requires extra legroom and immediate access to the aisle. Unlike some people, I've earned my status with this airline through years of loyalty, and I expect them to honor the accommodations I've been promised." "What medical condition?" Damien asked, his tone remaining level despite the provocation. "That's none of your business," Clayton snapped, his veneer of civility cracking. "And frankly, I don't appreciate your attitude. You clearly don't understand how things work in first class. This cabin is for people who've earned the privilege, not for—" He stopped himself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air, ugly and obvious. Mina's live stream had now reached 1,500 viewers, and the comments section had erupted, "Oh no, he didn't." Did this man really just say earned the privilege? Document everything. Someone please tell me this is being recorded. This is discrimination, period. Sue them all. Gavin returned from the cockpit, and Damien could see the calculation in his face, the weighing of options, the recognition that this situation was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare, but also the institutional bias that made removing a black passenger seem like the path of least resistance compared to disappointing a wealthy white executive. "Sir," Gavin said, addressing Damien again, "the captain has authorized me to ask you one final time to relocate to economy class. If you refuse, we will delay this flight and call airport security to remove you. Mr. Reed has priority status and documented medical needs, and we are obligated to accommodate him." Damien looked at Gavin, at Clayton Reed radiating entitled fury behind him, at Kylie Barnes who'd started this entire chain of events, at the phones now recording throughout the cabin. He thought about the options. He could escalate, demand to speak to the captain directly, force them to physically remove him while cameras rolled. He could invoke his ownership of the airline right now, watch their faces transform from dismissive to horrified as they realized exactly who they'd been trying to displace. But humiliation, Damien had learned, taught lessons that immediate revelation couldn't. Sometimes people needed to see exactly who they were, what they'd become, before they could understand the necessity of change. And sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't to prevent it, but to let it unfold fully, let the perpetrators reveal themselves completely, and then ensure accountability came with witnesses and documentation that couldn't be denied or minimized. So Damien closed his laptop, disconnected his noise-canceling headphones, and gathered his belongings with the same calm deliberateness he'd maintained throughout the encounter. "I'd like documentation that I'm being involuntarily removed from my assigned seat," he said. "A written statement from the crew explaining the reason, and confirmation that I'll be refunded the fare difference." Gavin looked surprised that the resistance had ended, then quickly nodded. "We'll provide all of that. Thank you for being reasonable." "I didn't say I was being reasonable," Damien corrected gently. I said I'd move. Those aren't the same thing. He pulled a business card from his wallet, plain white cardstock with minimal text, and handed it to Kylie Barnes. You'll want to keep this, he said. For your records. Kylie took the card, barely glancing at it before shoving it into her pocket, eager to end the confrontation and restore order to her cabin. Damien pulled a second card and offered it to Gavin Hart. You too. Make sure it goes in your incident report. Gavin accepted the card with obvious reluctance, but he didn't look at it either, too focused on making sure Damien actually relocated before Clayton Reed's impatience boiled over into a formal complaint. As Damien moved toward economy class, walking the length of the aircraft with his messenger bag over his shoulder and his head held high, he was aware of every eye on him, every phone camera tracking his progress. He was aware of the whispered conversations, the uncomfortable shifting of passengers who recognized injustice but didn't know how to respond, the satisfied smirk on Clayton Reed's face as he settled into seat 2A, the seat he'd claimed as his right. Damien was shown to seat 27C, a middle seat in economy between a teenager with headphones blasting music and a businessman who'd clearly already decided to pretend sleep rather than acknowledge his seatmates. The space was cramped after first class, the seat cushion thin, the air somehow stuffier despite being the same pressurized cabin. Damien stowed his messenger bag in the overhead bin this time. There was no room under the seat in front of him, not with his long legs already cramped against the seat back. As he fastened his seatbelt, he allowed himself a small, cold smile that none of his fellow passengers could see. He pulled out his phone and opened a secure app that most people didn't have access to, the Transcontinental Airways employee portal, complete with his executive-level credentials. He navigated to the employee records, pulling up profiles for Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart, employment dates, training certifications, performance reviews, disciplinary history. He took screenshots. Then he accessed the complaint database, searching for patterns. How many other passengers had reported discrimination, being removed from seats, or hostile treatment from crew? He took more screenshots. Finally, he sent a secure message to his general counsel. Need you to monitor a developing situation. We'll provide details on landing. Have video evidence. Prepare for potential litigation, but also internal disciplinary action. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule. Through the window, Damien watched Chicago fall away beneath him, the grid of streets and lights giving way to the patchwork of suburbs, and then the geometric patterns of farmland. 4 hours to Los Angeles. 4 hours while Mina Park's livestream continued to spread across social media, while his staff compiled the evidence he'd need, while Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart served drinks in first class with no idea that every action was being documented by the man they'd forced into seat 27C. 4 hours until landing changed everything. The moment the wheels touched down at LAX, Damien unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, stretching cramped muscles. He retrieved his messenger bag from the overhead bin and waited patiently while the cabin emptied row by row, watching Clayton Reed exit first class with his assistant, still radiating the self-satisfaction of someone who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. Damien followed at a distance, moving through the jetway with the crowd, emerging into the terminal where travelers scattered toward their connections or ground transportation. He saw Clayton Reed heading toward baggage claim, Gavin Hart and Kylie Barnes processing paperwork at the gate podium. Then Damien made a phone call. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "I need security, station management, and our general counsel to meet me at gate 51, now. And make sure there are witnesses. I want this done where everyone can see it." He ended the call and walked back toward the gate, where Kylie and Gavin were just finishing their post-flight duties, probably eager to clock out and forget about the uncomfortable incident on Flight 447. "Excuse me," Damien said, his voice cutting through their conversation. Both attendants looked up, their expression shifting to annoyance at being delayed by the passenger they'd successfully displaced. "We're done with our duties," Kylie said, her tone dismissive. "If you want to file a complaint, you can do that through the airline's website." "Actually," Damien said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a different business card, this one embossed with the Transcontinental Airways logo. "I think we're going to handle this a different way." He handed the card to Gavin Hart, who looked at it with obvious confusion, reading the text that Kylie Barnes hadn't bothered to check hours earlier. Damien Cross. Chief Executive Officer, Crosswell Group Majority Owner, Transcontinental Airways. The color drained from Gavin's face. He looked from the card to Damien to the gate around them, where airport security and several airline executives in suits were now approaching rapidly, and the full magnitude of what had just happened began to register. Kylie, still not understanding, frowned at Gavin's expression. What? What is it? Gavin couldn't speak. He simply handed her the business card, and Damien watched as comprehension crashed over her like a wave, her face transforming from confusion to horror in the span of a heartbeat. "Oh God," she whispered. "Yes," Damien said quietly. "Oh God, indeed." Behind him, Mina Park had followed from the aircraft, her live stream still running, her camera capturing everything as 3 million viewers watched the exact moment two flight attendants realized they'd just humiliated their own boss, and that accountability, filmed and documented and shared around the world, was about to arrive without mercy. The security team arrived first, 3 officers in crisp uniforms with radios crackling at their shoulders, their expressions shifting from routine alert to sharp attention as they took in the scene. 2 flight attendants frozen in place, faces drained of color, and a well-dressed passenger holding a business card that had apparently stopped time itself. Behind them came Sharon Ortega, the station manager for Transcontinental Airways at LAX, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years putting out fires in one of the world's busiest airports. Sharon's eyes swept the gate area, cataloging details with practiced speed. The crowd of passengers lingering to watch instead of dispersing toward baggage claim, the phone still recording, Mina Park's live stream camera capturing everything from 10 feet away. Her gaze landed on Damien, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or the sick realization that whatever was happening here was already far beyond a routine customer service failure. "Mr. Cross?" she said, her voice carefully neutral, despite the tension radiating through every syllable. "I wasn't aware you were on this flight." "Neither was your crew," Damien replied, his tone carrying the same dangerous calm he'd maintained throughout the incident, which became abundantly clear when they demanded I move from my assigned first-class seat to accommodate another passenger. Sharon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced at Kylie and Gavin, who stood like defendants awaiting sentencing, then back to Damien. "Perhaps we should discuss this in the office." "No." The word cut through the terminal noise with absolute finality. "What happened to me happened here, in public, in front of cameras and witnesses. Whatever comes next happens the same way. I won't let this get buried in a backroom meeting where everyone can pretend it was just a misunderstanding that we've quietly resolved." Mina's live stream chat exploded with reactions. "Yes, make them face it publicly. This is what accountability looks like. Sharon looks like she wants to die. Someone check on Kylie, I think she stopped breathing." Sharon Ortega had not reached her position by being slow to adapt to crisis situations. She nodded once, accepting the terms Damien had set, and turned to face Kylie and Gavin with an expression that promised nothing good. "Tell me exactly what happened on Flight 447. Everything." Kylie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her hands twisted together in front of her uniform, knuckles white with pressure. There was a Platinum Elite member who needed seat 2A, and Mr. Cross was, the passenger in that seat was asked to relocate to economy class to accommodate. "You asked a paying first-class passenger to move to economy?" Sharon interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "On what grounds?" "Company policy," Gavin said, finding his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. Platinum Elite members received priority accommodation, and Mr. Reed had medical documentation requiring— "Show me the documentation," Damien said quietly. Gavin blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The medical documentation that justified removing me from my seat. I'd like to see it." Federal regulations require airlines to provide specific accommodations for passengers with disabilities, but those accommodations don't include the right to displace other passengers from confirmed seats. So I'm curious what Mr. Reed's documentation actually said. The silence that followed was answer enough. Gavin's gaze dropped to the floor, and Kylie looked like she might be sick. "There wasn't any documentation, was there?" Damien continued, his voice still level, but now carrying an edge that made several bystanders shift uncomfortably. Mr. Reed claimed medical necessity, and you accepted that claim without verification because it gave you justification to do what you'd already decided to do: remove me from first class. We were trying to provide good customer service, Kylie said, her voice breaking slightly. Mr. Reed is an important client, and he specifically requested that seat, and I thought— You thought what? Damien asked, and now there was no gentleness left in his tone, just cold precision cutting through excuses and evasions. You thought a black man in first class was probably flying on miles or an upgrade and wouldn't put up much resistance if you threatened him? You thought keeping a wealthy white executive happy was more important than honoring the ticket I paid for? You thought no one would care if you humiliated me in front of a cabin full of witnesses? It wasn't about race, Gavin interjected, the words automatic, defensive. Mr. Reed has been a platinum member for years. He flies with us constantly, and we're supposed to accommodate our most loyal customers. Then why didn't you ask someone else to move? The question came from Mina Park, who'd stepped closer with her phone still recording, her voice carrying clearly through the gate area. There were other passengers in first class. Why did it have to be him? Why was he the one who wouldn't mind sitting in economy? Gavin's mouth opened, closed, opened again with no words emerging. The answer, the real answer that lived beneath corporate policy and customer service training, was too ugly to speak aloud, but it hung in the air anyway, visible to everyone watching. Sharon Ortega closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, her expression had hardened into something that looked like acceptance of an unpleasant duty. How many other passengers did you ask before approaching Mr. Cross? She asked Kylie. I didn't ask anyone else. Mr. Reed specifically wanted seat 2A, and that's where Mr. Cross was sitting, so you went directly to the one black passenger in first class and demanded he move. Sharon's voice had gone flat, factual, the tone of someone documenting evidence for a report she'd have to write. Did you verify his ticket class before approaching? Kylie hesitated, and that hesitation was damning. His boarding pass was for first class, but I thought maybe it was an upgrade, or— You assumed, Sharon repeated. You assumed a black man in seat 2A must not really belong there, despite having a valid boarding pass, despite being appropriately dressed, despite doing nothing except sitting in his assigned seat. That's not what I meant, Kylie protested, tears now visible at the corners of her eyes. I would have asked anyone in that seat to move. It wasn't about— But you didn't ask anyone else, Damien interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a scalpel. Mr. Reed wanted seat 2A, and you immediately decided the person sitting there was disposable. You didn't offer me another first-class seat. You didn't ask if I'd accept compensation for the inconvenience. You ordered me to move to economy, and when I asked about policy, you threatened to have me arrested. He pulled out his phone, opening the voice recording he'd made during the incident, and played back Kylie's words. If you refuse to comply with crew instructions, that's a federal violation, and I can have you removed from this flight entirely. The words echoed through the gate area, and several passengers watching nearby shook their heads in disgust. Mina's livestream chat was scrolling too fast to read individual comments, thousands of viewers reacting in real time to the evidence of discrimination that couldn't be explained away or minimized. Sharon turned to Gavin. And you? When Ms. Barnes called you for support, what exactly did you tell Mr. Cross? Gavin's jaw worked, muscles tensing beneath his skin. I explained that Mr. Reed was a valued customer with status and corporate connections, and that we needed to maintain good relationships with our most important clients. You told me, Damien corrected, that Clayton Reed was a senior executive with one of the airline's corporate partners and that I should appreciate this was just business. You also felt the need to specify that this wasn't about race, unprompted, which suggested you were aware that race was absolutely a factor. I was trying to de-escalate, Gavin said, his voice rising defensively. You were being difficult, refusing to move, and I was trying to find a way to resolve the situation without what? Damien's voice cracked through the terminal like a whip. Without having to admit you were wrong? Without acknowledging that you had no legal or policy basis for what you were demanding? or without having to face the uncomfortable truth that you were removing me specifically because you assumed a black passenger would be easier to intimidate than explaining to a white executive that his loyalty status doesn't entitle him to someone else's seat? Gavin's face flushed red, anger mixing with humiliation. You don't understand the pressures we face. We have performance metrics based on customer satisfaction scores from elite members, and if we don't accommodate people like Mr. Reed, our evaluations suffer, we lose bonus opportunities. So you sacrifice my dignity to protect your bonus. Damien's voice had gone quiet again, but the fury beneath the surface was palpable, a controlled burn that was somehow more frightening than shouting. You humiliated me in front of 100 witnesses, violated my rights as a paying customer, and potentially exposed this airline to massive legal liability, all because accommodating discrimination was easier than doing your job correctly. Sharon Ortega had heard enough. She turned to the security officers who'd been standing silently throughout the exchange. Please escort Ms. Barnes and Mr. Hart to the crew lounge and ensure they remain there until HR can conduct a full investigation. They're suspended from duty, effective immediately pending review. You can't do this, Kylie burst out, tears now streaming openly down her face. I have a mortgage. I need this job. I was just following the policies we were trained on. Show me the training material that tells you to remove passengers based on race, Sharon said, her voice like ice. Show me the policy manual that says loyalty status trumps confirmed seat assignments. Show me anything in your crew handbook that authorizes what you did today, and I'll reconsider. Kylie couldn't respond. Neither could Gavin. They stood there in their uniforms that suddenly looked like costumes, authority stripped away to reveal the petty prejudices and lazy assumptions beneath. As security led them away, Mina called out, Hey, Kylie, do you have anything to say to the people watching? Any apology for what you did? Kylie looked back, her face blotchy with tears and shame, but she couldn't seem to find words. She just shook her head and let security guide her toward the crew areas, disappearing into the maze of airport corridors where the public never went. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, some passengers lingering to speak in hushed tones, others pulling out their own phones to check if the incident was trending yet online. Mina ended her live stream with a final comment. And that, everyone, is what happens when you discriminate against the wrong person. Or really, against anyone. But especially when that person turns out to be your boss. Sharon Ortega waited until the immediate spectators had moved away before turning back to Damien. Mr. Cross, I apologize on behalf of Transcontinental Airways. What happened today was unacceptable, and I assure you will conduct a thorough investigation and take appropriate action. With respect, Miss Ortega, Damien interrupted, I don't want assurances. I want accountability. And I want to understand how two crew members felt comfortable doing what they did, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This happens when corporate culture tolerates it, when training fails to prevent it, when management doesn't enforce consequences consistently. Sharon's expression tightened, but she nodded. You're absolutely right. And if I'm honest, this isn't the first complaint we've received about discriminatory treatment, but it's the first time we've had this much documentation, this many witnesses, and, she paused, choosing her words carefully, this level of executive attention. How many complaints? Damien asked sharply. Sharon hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I'd need to pull the exact numbers from our system, but in the past year alone, we've had at least 24 formal complaints about crew members treating black passengers differently, questioning their ticket class, scrutinizing their IDs more aggressively, assuming they're in the wrong seats. 24 that were formal complaints, Damien said. How many incidents went unreported because passengers didn't think anything would change, or because they were embarrassed, or because they didn't want to miss their flights fighting a battle they assumed they'd lose? The question hung unanswered because both of them knew the real number was exponentially higher. Countless moments of subtle and overt discrimination that never made it into official records, that lived only in the memories of passengers who'd been made to feel unwelcome on an airline they'd paid to use. A new figure approached from the terminal concourse, a black man in his 30s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with a Transcontinental Airways logo, carrying a tablet and walking with the purposeful stride of someone who knew these terminals intimately. His name tag identified him as Marcus Webb, and when he reached Damien and Sharon, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes showed recognition of something significant unfolding. Ms. Ortega, Marcus said, nodding respectfully to the station manager before turning to Damien. Mr. Cross, I'm the senior gate coordinator for this terminal. I heard there was an incident on Flight 447, and I wanted to offer any assistance needed. Marcus has been with us for 8 years, Sharon explained. He's one of our most experienced ground staff. Damien studied Marcus for a moment, reading the careful professionalism that Black employees in customer-facing roles learn to adopt, the extra layer of correctness that came from knowing they'd be judged more harshly for any mistake. Mr. Webb, can I ask you a question? Off the record, just between us, how often do you see crew members treat Black passengers differently than white passengers? Marcus glanced at Sharon, clearly weighing the risks of honest answer versus the safety of corporate deflection. Something in Damien's expression must have convinced him, because he took a breath and spoke with careful precision. Often enough that we notice it. Not every crew member, not even most, but there's a pattern. Black passengers get questioned about upgrades more frequently. They get asked for additional ID verification. Gate agents watch them more closely during boarding, like they're expecting problems. And in first class, he paused, shaking his head. In first class, I've seen crew members treat Black passengers like they're playing dress-up in spaces they don't really belong. Has anyone reported this to management? Damien asked. Some have tried, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. But it's hard to prove intent. Crew members can always say they were just following policy, or that they treat all passengers the same way, and without video evidence it becomes, he said, she said. Most of us learned it's easier to just provide excellent service ourselves and hope that compensates for the crew members who don't. Damien nodded slowly, filing away every word. Thank you for your honesty. It takes courage to speak truth when you know it might have professional consequences. Marcus met his eyes directly. With respect, sir, I've watched this airline decline for years because leadership didn't want to hear uncomfortable truths. If you're actually willing to listen, then, yeah, I'll tell you what I see. And there are a lot of other employees who would too, if they believed anything would change. Things are going to change, Damien said, and there was absolute certainty in his voice. I can promise you that. Sharon's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen before her expression tightened. Mr. Cross, I'm getting messages from our PR department. Apparently the live stream from your flight has been picked up by several news outlets, and our corporate communications team is asking how they should respond. Tell them to respond with the truth, Damien said flatly. 2 crew members violated company policy and federal regulations by attempting to remove a passenger from a confirmed seat based on discriminatory assumptions. Those crew members have been suspended pending investigation, and the airline is conducting a comprehensive review of training and enforcement procedures to ensure this doesn't happen again. They're going to want to offer you compensation, Sharon said carefully. Perhaps an upgrade to lifetime platinum status, travel vouchers. I don't want vouchers, Damien interrupted, his voice hardening. I want systemic change. I want every crew member who thinks loyalty status gives them permission to discriminate to understand there will be immediate and severe consequences. I want training that actually addresses implicit bias instead of generic sensitivity modules everyone clicks through without paying attention. And I want accountability that doesn't depend on whether the victim of discrimination happens to own the company. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages that had accumulated during the confrontation. His general counsel had already compiled preliminary research. Transcontinental Airways had settled at least 6 discrimination lawsuits in the past 3 years, all with non-disclosure agreements that kept the incidents quiet. The NAACP had previously flagged the airline for concerning patterns in passenger treatment, and internal complaint records showed dozens of reported incidents that had resulted in minimal disciplinary action. Here's what's going to happen, Damien said, looking up from his phone with an expression that made Sharon Ortega straighten unconsciously. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Every executive involved in operations, training, and HR will attend. We're going to review every discrimination complaint filed in the past 5 years, every settlement paid, every piece of training material currently in use. And then we're going to build a new system, one that doesn't just respond to discrimination after it happens, but actively prevents it. Sharon nodded slowly. That's significant, Mr. Cross. It'll require substantial resources. We have substantial resources, Damien replied. We also have a substantial problem. The question isn't whether we can afford to fix this, it's whether we can afford not to. A commotion near the baggage claim area drew their attention. Clayton Reed had returned, flanked by his assistant and looking distinctly displeased. He spotted Damien and marched over with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through sheer force of personality. "There you are," Clayton said, his tone suggesting Damien had inconvenienced him personally by existing. "I wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings about the seat situation. I'm sure you understand, business travelers with status need certain accommodations, and economy really isn't so bad these days. I actually think you'll find it builds character, helps you appreciate—" "Mr. Reed," Sharon Ortega interrupted, her voice cutting through his patronizing lecture with surgical precision. "I'm going to need you to stop talking." Clayton blinked, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted by airline employees. "Excuse me?" "You heard Ms. Ortega," Damien said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. "Stop talking, because everything you say right now is being mentally cataloged for the lawsuit I'm considering filing, and the more you speak, the stronger that case becomes." "Lawsuit?" Clayton's face flushed red. "Over a seat reassignment? Don't be ridiculous. I have platinum elite status, I had medical documentation, and the crew agreed I had priority." "You lied about medical necessity to displace another passenger," Damien said flatly. "That's fraud. You also made several comments suggesting you believed I didn't belong in first class based on my race. That's discrimination. And your entire justification rested on the assumption that your loyalty status gave you the right to my confirmed seat, which it doesn't, according to both the airline's contract of carriage and federal regulations." Clayton's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Damien pulled out another business card, the official one with the Transcontinental Airways logo, and handed it to Clayton with the same calm deliberateness he'd shown throughout this entire disaster. "I'm the majority owner of the airline you just committed fraud on, and the person whose corporate partnerships you referenced, those contracts come up for renewal next quarter, and I'm suddenly very interested in reviewing the terms." The color drained from Clayton's face as he read the card, his hand beginning to tremble slightly. His assistant, standing behind him, had gone pale and was frantically typing on her phone, probably alerting their own corporate legal team that their boss had just stepped into a situation far more serious than a simple travel dispute. I didn't know," Clayton stammered, the bluster evaporating like morning fog. "If I'd known you were an executive with the airline—" "That's the problem, Mr. Reed," Damien said, his voice cold enough to frost glass. "You assumed I wasn't. You assumed I was someone you could push around, someone whose dignity mattered less than your convenience, someone who would accept humiliation because challenging it seemed too difficult or too risky. And you made those assumptions based on looking at me and deciding I didn't belong in the seat I'd paid for." Clayton opened his mouth, closed it, looked desperately at Sharon Ortega as if she might intervene on his behalf. She stared back with an expression of profound professional distance, making it clear he'd get no rescue from that quarter. "I think," Sharon said carefully, "that Mr. Reed should consult with his company's legal counsel before this conversation continues. And Mr. Reed, you should know that I'll be filing a report about this incident with our security and compliance departments, and your behavior will be noted in our customer records." "This is outrageous," Clayton blustered, trying to recover some dignity. "I'm a Platinum Elite member. I've flown hundreds of thousands of miles with this airline." "Had," Damien corrected quietly. "Past tense. Because as of right now, your elite status is suspended pending investigation, and I'd suggest you find alternative travel arrangements for the foreseeable future." Clayton Reed stared at him, the full weight of consequences finally penetrating his entitled assumptions. His face worked through several expressions: outrage, disbelief, calculation, and finally something that might have been the earliest stirrings of genuine concern. He turned without another word and stalked away, his assistant hurrying to keep pace, both of them disappearing into the terminal crowd. Marcus Webb, who'd witnessed the entire exchange, let out a low whistle. That man just learned a very expensive lesson. "Hopefully," Damien said, though his expression suggested he wasn't optimistic about Clayton Reed's capacity for growth. "But even if he doesn't change, everyone watching will understand that this airline won't protect discrimination anymore." Sharon's phone buzzed again, and this time when she checked it, Her expression shifted to something more urgent. Mr. Cross, our CEO is asking to speak with you immediately, and our PR department says the story has been picked up by CNN, ABC, and several major outlets. They're calling it CEO Forced to Economy Class, and there's significant public backlash building. Good, Damien said simply. Let it build, because the backlash isn't the problem. The discrimination that caused it is the problem, and the only way to fix it is to acknowledge it fully, accept responsibility completely, and implement changes that prevent it from happening again. He looked around the gate area, at the terminal stretching in both directions, at the thousands of passengers moving through this space every day. And he thought about all the moments of casual discrimination that happened in airports and airplanes across the country, the assumptions, the stereotypes, the countless small indignities that people of color endured because challenging them seemed too exhausting or too futile. But he wasn't too exhausted, and this wasn't futile. He had resources. He had power. And most importantly, he had documentation and witnesses, and 3 million people who'd watched discrimination unfold in real time and couldn't now pretend it didn't exist. Sharon, he said, turning back to the station manager, I want you to compile every discrimination complaint filed at LAX in the past 3 years. Every incident report, every passenger statement, every crew member disciplinary action. I want names, dates, outcomes, everything. Can you have that ready by morning? Yes, sir, Sharon said, already making notes on her tablet. Anything else? Yes. I want contact information for every employee who filed complaints about discriminatory treatment they witnessed or experienced personally. I want to hear their stories directly, not filtered through HR summaries. Because if we're going to fix this system, we need to understand exactly how broken it is. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. Mr. Cross, if you're serious about hearing from employees, I can help coordinate that. There's an informal network of ground crew and flight attendants who've been talking about these issues for years. They'll talk to you if they believe you're actually listening. I'm listening, Damien said, meeting Marcus's eyes with absolute sincerity. And more than that, I'm acting. Because I didn't buy this airline just to extract profit from it. I bought it because I saw potential for something better. An airline that treats both employees and passengers with dignity, that doesn't tolerate discrimination, and that understands excellent service starts with excellent culture. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 8 p.m., and the adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. But there was too much to do, too many pieces to set in motion before he could afford to rest. I need a conference room, he said to Sharon. Somewhere I can work tonight, make calls, start assembling the team we'll need for tomorrow's meeting. Sharon nodded. We have executive facilities in the operations center. I'll have someone escort you there and make sure you have everything you need. As they walked through the terminal, Damien was aware of passengers recognizing him, some from the flight itself, others from news reports or social media that had spread the story while he'd been confronting Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart. People pointed, whispered, a few raised their phones to record, and one older black woman approached him near the security checkpoint. Excuse me, she said, her voice soft but carrying unmistakable emotion. I just wanted to thank you for not letting them get away with it, for standing up even when they tried to push you down. My grandson flies for business all the time, and he tells me stories about how crew members treat him, and her voice broke slightly. Thank you for fighting back. Damien felt something crack in the professional armor he'd maintained throughout this entire ordeal, a moment of genuine human connection that reminded him why this mattered beyond corporate policy and legal liability. He took the woman's hand gently. What's your grandson's name? He asked. Terrence. Terrence Morrison. He works in pharmaceutical sales. Damien pulled out his phone and made a note. If Terrence has experienced discrimination on any transcontinental airways flights, I want to hear about it. Not through official channels, not filtered through customer service, directly from him. Can you give me his contact information? The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and recited a phone number that Damien carefully entered into his contacts. He won't believe me when I tell him about this, she said, wiping her eyes. He'll think I'm making it up. Tell him to check the news, Damien said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. And tell him that things are going to change. Not overnight, not perfectly, but they're going to change. As the woman walked away, Sharon Ortega watched Damien with an expression that mixed professional respect with something deeper. Perhaps recognition that she was witnessing the kind of leadership that didn't just manage crises, but transformed them into opportunities for fundamental change. "That was kind," she said quietly. "That was necessary," Damien corrected, "because Terrence Morrison and his grandmother and millions of other people need to see that speaking up matters, that complaints get heard, that change is possible. Otherwise, what's the point of all this?" They reached the operations center, a secured area behind the ticket counters where airline staff coordinated flights, managed crews, and handled the 1,000 daily crises that kept a major airport functioning. Sharon led him to a conference room with glass walls overlooking the terminal, provided him with Wi-Fi credentials and access codes, and assured him someone would bring coffee and food. When the door closed and Damien was finally alone, he allowed himself one moment, just one, to feel the full weight of what had happened. The humiliation of being ordered from his seat. The rage at Kylie Barnes's assumptions and Gavin Hart's condescension. The cold calculation required to document everything while maintaining composure. The exhaustion of having to prove his humanity and his right to occupy a space he'd paid for. Then he opened his laptop, pulled up the first of many documents he'd need to review, and got to work. Because the moment for feeling was over. Now came the moment for doing, for transforming personal violation into systemic change, for ensuring that what happened to him today would be harder for discrimination to happen to anyone tomorrow. Outside the conference room, LAX continued its eternal rhythm. Planes landing and departing, passengers arriving and leaving, the vast machinery of modern travel grinding forward. But inside that room, surrounded by evidence of discrimination and armed with the power to demand accountability, Damien Cross began building something different. Not just a better airline, a better system. A better answer to the question of whether justice was possible when those with power finally decided to wield it on behalf of dignity instead of convenience. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over Los Angeles, everyone who'd participated in what happened on Flight 447 would discover exactly what that looked like. The coffee arrived at midnight, carried by a young operations coordinator named Jennifer, who looked exhausted from her own shift but brightened when she recognized Damien from the news alerts flooding her phone. She set down a thermos and a plate of sandwiches from the crew lounge, then hesitated in the doorway as if wanting to say something but uncertain whether she should. "Go ahead," Damien said, not looking up from the spreadsheet he'd been building for the past 3 hours, a comprehensive database of every discrimination complaint filed across all transcontinental airways hubs, organized by date, location, crew member involved, and outcome. Jennifer took a breath. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're doing this. I've worked here for 2 years and I've seen things that made me uncomfortable, but I never knew who to tell or if it would matter. Flight attendants talking about passengers in the break room, making assumptions based on how people look, joking about who really belongs in first class. It always felt wrong, but I'm just ops coordination, so I figured it wasn't my place to say anything." Damien finally looked up, studying her face, young, earnest, carrying the guilt of complicity that came from witnessing injustice and not knowing how to stop it. "It's always your place," he said quietly. "Discrimination doesn't just happen because of the people who actively perpetrate it. It happens because of everyone who sees it and decides it's not their problem to solve." Jennifer nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Well, I'm telling you now. Gate 52, about 6 months ago. I saw a flight attendant. I don't remember her name, but I could probably identify her from photos. She questioned a black woman's boarding pass 3 times, made her step aside while other passengers boarded, called for a supervisor to verify the ticket was legitimate. The woman was flying first class on a paid fare, everything was valid, but the attendant treated her like she was trying to scam her way onto the plane. Did anyone file a complaint? I don't know. The passenger looked humiliated, and by the time the supervisor cleared everything up, she just wanted to get on the plane and forget about it. But I remember thinking how wrong it was, how that same attendant had let a white man board without even glancing at his pass right before. Damien added the information to his growing database, noting the date and gate number. If you remember anything else, names, specific incidents, patterns you've noticed, I want to hear about it. And I want you to know that speaking up now isn't a betrayal of your colleagues. It's the only way any of this gets better. Jennifer nodded and left, and Damien returned to his work, but her story joined the dozens of others he'd compiled from complaint records, from conversations with Marcus Webb, who'd stopped by twice more with additional employee contacts, from his own observations during months of flying transcontinental routes. While the airline's leadership remained blissfully unaware, their new majority owner was documenting every failure. By 3 a.m, the picture was devastatingly clear. Transcontinental Airways didn't just have a discrimination problem. It had a discrimination culture, one that had been allowed to fester for years because leadership had chosen the path of least resistance at every decision point. Complaints were minimized as misunderstandings. Crew members received written warnings that went into files no one ever reviewed. Settlements were paid with NDAs that kept problems hidden. And passengers who might have spoken up learned through experience that nothing would change. So why bother fighting? The data showed patterns that would have been obvious to anyone actually looking. Black passengers were disproportionately selected for additional ID verification, questioned about upgrade legitimacy, and seated in less desirable locations even when better seats were available. Crew members who received multiple complaints faced minimal consequences if they maintained good relationships with supervisors. And the training materials Damien had pulled from HR databases were generic corporate boilerplate that mentioned treating all customers with respect without ever addressing the specific mechanisms of racial bias or providing concrete tools for prevention. Damien's phone buzzed with an incoming call. His general counsel, Lauren Chen, who'd been working through the night from her office in San Francisco, assembling the legal framework they'd need for tomorrow's emergency board meeting. "Tell me you've been sleeping," she said without preamble. "Tell me you have," Damien countered. "Touché. I've got preliminary analysis on our liability exposure from today's incident and the broader pattern it represents. You want the good news or the bad news?" "There's good news?" "The good news is that by acting immediately and decisively, we can probably limit direct legal exposure from the Flight 447 incident to something manageable. You documented everything. We suspended the crew members within hours, and we're implementing system-wide reforms before any lawsuit gets filed. That shows good faith and substantially weakens a plaintiff's case." "And the bad news?" Lauren's sigh carried clearly through the phone connection. "The bad news is that the pattern of discrimination we're uncovering creates potential class action exposure that could run into 9 figures if we don't get ahead of it. We've got enough documented incidents, enough settlements with NDAs that suggest consciousness of wrongdoing, and enough evidence of inadequate training and enforcement that a good plaintiff's attorney could build a compelling case for systemic discrimination." Damien leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his palms. "So we're looking at substantial financial liability, regardless of how we proceed." "Yes. But here's the thing, Damien, and I'm speaking as your lawyer, but also as someone who cares about doing the right thing. We can either spend that money defending ourselves in court while the public relations nightmare destroys the brand, or we can spend it proactively fixing the system and potentially save both money and reputation in the long run. Not to mention treating people with basic human dignity." "That too," Lauren agreed with a hint of warmth in her professional tone. "Though I notice you lead with the moral argument while I have to frame it in financial terms. That's why you're the CEO and I'm the lawyer. You're the lawyer who's been working for 16 straight hours on this, so I'd say your moral compass is functioning fine." Damien pulled up another document on his screen, a draft reform proposal he'd been building. "I'm sending you something. Tell me if it's legally viable." He hit send and waited while Lauren opened the file, hearing her sharp intake of breath as she read through his proposed changes. The document outlined a comprehensive overhaul of Transcontinental Airways discrimination prevention and accountability systems. Mandatory implicit bias training for all customer-facing employees with quarterly refreshers and competency testing. A dedicated ombudsperson position reporting directly to the CEO for handling discrimination complaints. Real-time reporting mechanisms that bypassed local management. Automatic investigation triggers when crew members received multiple complaints. Immediate suspension pending investigation for clear violations. And a publicly accessible transparency report detailing complaints, investigations, and outcomes. The proposal also included a $10 million scholarship fund for students from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation, partnerships with civil rights organizations to develop and review training materials, and an independent advisory board with authority to review policies and recommend changes. This is ambitious, Lauren said finally, and expensive. The board is going to push back hard on the costs. The board doesn't have a choice, Damien replied, his voice hardening. We own controlling interest. If they want to argue that preventing discrimination is too expensive, they're welcome to have that conversation in a public meeting where I'll be happy to explain that they value short-term profit margins over basic human decency. You know, some of them will resign rather than accept this. Good. I'd rather have board members who support this mission than those who view it as an expensive inconvenience. We'll replace them with people who understand that a company's value isn't just measured in quarterly earnings. Lauren was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried unconcealed admiration. You know, when you first proposed buying an airline, I thought you were crazy. Transportation is brutal, margins are thin, and you were moving away from the investment strategies that made Crosswell successful. But I'm starting to think you saw something the rest of us missed. I saw an opportunity to prove that business success and ethical operation aren't mutually exclusive, Damien said. I saw a chance to demonstrate that treating people with dignity isn't just morally right, it's good business, because employees who feel valued create better customer experiences, and customers who feel respected become loyal advocates. Well, after today, you're going to get a chance to prove that thesis with the entire world watching. They ended the call, and Damien returned to his preparation, knowing that in a few hours the sun would rise and the real work would begin. But first, there was one more call he needed to make. He dialed a number from memory, unsurprised when it was answered on the second ring despite the early hour. His mother, Evelyn Cross, had always been an early riser, and she'd probably been awake since the news broke anyway. "Baby," she said, her voice carrying the particular blend of concern and pride that only mothers could achieve. "I've been watching the news. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom. Tired, but fine." "That flight attendant had no right treating you that way. And that man who wanted your seat? Lord have mercy, the entitlement. I hope you're going to sue them all." Damien smiled despite his exhaustion. "I'm going to do something better than sue them. I'm going to fix the system that allowed it to happen." "That's my son," Evelyn said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Your father would be so proud. He always said the measure of a man isn't how he handles success. It's what he does when someone tries to diminish him." Damien thought of his father, Marcus Cross, who'd worked 30 years as an electrician in Detroit, who'd faced countless moments of discrimination with quiet dignity and iron resolve, who taught his son that anger at injustice was righteous, but action against injustice was holy. Marcus had died 5 years ago, just months before Crosswell Group's first major success, never getting to see his son build an empire, but having provided every tool needed to do so. "I wish he could see this," Damien said quietly. "He can," Evelyn replied with absolute certainty. "And he's probably up there organizing all the other ancestors to make sure you have the strength to see this through. But Damien, baby, I need you to remember something." "What's that?" "Don't let this consume you. Don't let the anger at what happened turn into bitterness that eats at your soul. Fix the system, hold people accountable, demand justice, but don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. Your father fought discrimination his whole life, and it took a toll. I don't want that for you." "I'll be careful, Mom. I promise." "You better be. And when this settles down, you're coming home for Sunday dinner. I'm making your favorite. Pot roast with the garlic mashed potatoes? And apple pie. Don't think I forgot." They said goodbye, and Damien felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. His mother had always possessed the gift of perspective, the ability to see both the immediate battle and the longer war, to understand that winning individual fights meant nothing if you lost yourself in the process. He was gathering his materials to head back to his hotel for a few hours of sleep when Sharon Ortega appeared in the conference room doorway, looking as exhausted as Damien felt, but carrying a thick folder of documents. "I thought you'd gone home hours ago," Damien said. "I tried," Sharon replied, settling into a chair across from him. "But I kept thinking about everything that happened today, and I realized I couldn't sleep until I'd compiled this." She pushed the folder across the table. Every discrimination complaint filed at LAX in the past 3 years, like you requested. But I also included my own observations. Incidents I witnessed that never made it into official reports. Patterns I noticed but didn't know how to address. Conversations I overheard that should have resulted in discipline but didn't. Damien opened the folder, scanning the first few pages and feeling his jaw tighten at the sheer volume of documented incidents. This is comprehensive. It's damning, Sharon corrected bluntly. And it's incomplete, because these are just the incidents that left some kind of paper trail. The real number is probably 3 or 4 times higher. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Cross, I need to tell you something, and it's not easy to admit. I've been station manager here for 8 years. I've seen discrimination happen, I've received complaints, and while I'd like to believe I always handled them appropriately, the truth is I probably could have done more. I could have pushed harder for real consequences. I could have escalated patterns to corporate instead of handling them locally. I could have been more aggressive about challenging the culture that allowed this to flourish. Why didn't you? Sharon met his eyes directly. Because I convinced myself that incremental change was better than no change. Because I told myself that getting crew members to attend 1-hour diversity training was progress, even when nothing actually changed in how they treated passengers. Because fighting the system felt exhausting and futile, and it was easier to focus on the things I could control rather than the things I couldn't. The honesty in her admission was striking, not defensive or evasive, but carrying the weight of genuine self-reflection and regret. Damien studied her face, seeing the fatigue that came from years of compromising principles in service of pragmatism, and recognized something of his own journey in her expression. He'd made his own compromises over the years, chosen battles strategically rather than fighting every injustice, told himself that building power first meant he could do more good later. Maybe that had been true. Maybe it had been rationalization, probably both. Sharon, I'm going to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Can you be part of the solution? Not the person you were yesterday, managing complaints and maintaining the status quo, but the person this airline needs tomorrow. Someone willing to challenge discrimination actively, enforce consequences consistently, and risk being unpopular with crew members who don't want to change? Sharon didn't answer immediately, taking time to genuinely consider the question rather than offering reflexive assurances. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I can be that person. I want to be that person. But I'm also aware that I've been part of the problem. And if you decide you need someone without that history, someone who can come in fresh without the baggage of past failures, I'll understand. I don't need someone fresh, Damien said. I need someone who understands the culture intimately, who knows which crew members to trust and which ones have been skating by on minimal compliance, who can identify the subtle patterns that outsiders would miss. I need someone with institutional knowledge and the willingness to use it for real reform. The question is whether you can be that person while also carrying the discomfort of knowing you didn't do it sooner. I can carry that discomfort, Sharon said firmly, and I can use it as motivation to make sure we get this right. Then you're going to be my point person for implementation at LAX. I'll need you in the board meeting tomorrow. This morning, actually, he corrected, glancing at his watch and seeing it was nearly 4 a.m. I want you to present what you've compiled here, to walk the board through specific incidents and explain how our current systems failed to prevent them. Can you do that? Sharon nodded, something like relief crossing her face. I can do that. And Mr. Cross? Thank you. For not letting this get buried. For caring enough to do something. After she left, Damien finally allowed himself to leave the operations center, walking through terminals that were eerily quiet in the pre-dawn hours, passing closed storefronts and gates waiting for morning flights. A custodial worker nodded to him as he passed, and Damien found himself wondering how many times that worker had witnessed discrimination, had seen passengers treated differently based on skin color, and had felt powerless to intervene. The hotel was mercifully close. Damien had booked a room at the airport Marriott specifically to minimize travel time between meetings. He showered quickly, washing away the accumulated tension of the longest day, then set his alarm for 7 a.m. and collapsed into bed with his mind still racing through tomorrow's agenda. But exhaustion won, and he slept dreamlessly for 3 hours until the alarm dragged him back to consciousness, and the reality that today would determine whether Flight 447 became just another viral moment that faded into social media history, or whether it became the catalyst for genuine change. By 8:30, Damien stood in the boardroom of Transcontinental Airways Los Angeles headquarters, a sleek glass and steel building near Marina del Rey that housed the airline's Western regional operations. The emergency board meeting he'd called had drawn every senior executive within flying distance. The CEO, Robert Matthews, a silver-haired veteran of the industry who'd been running Transcontinental for 6 years with declining results. The CFO, Diana Reyes, who'd been skeptical of Crosswell Group's acquisition from the start. The head of HR, Patricia Gunderson, who looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight, and various vice presidents responsible for operations, training, customer service, and legal compliance. Also present was Lauren Chen via video conference from San Francisco, Marcus Webb, who'd come representing ground staff perspectives, Sharon Ortega with her damning folder of complaints, and 2 board members who'd flown in overnight, James Thornton, a retired airline executive who'd initially opposed Damien's reform proposals, and Keisha Williams, a civil rights attorney who'd been appointed to the board as part of Crosswell Group's acquisition terms. The room carried the electric tension of people who knew their jobs and reputations hung in the balance, who'd read the news coverage and seen the live stream and understood that what happened in this meeting would determine whether Transcontinental Airways survived as a viable company or became a cautionary tale about corporate failure. Damien didn't bother with pleasantries. He opened his laptop, connected it to the room's presentation screen, and pulled up Mina Park's live stream footage from Flight 447. "Before we discuss solutions," he said, his voice cutting through the nervous murmurs, "I want everyone in this room to watch exactly what happened yesterday. Not a sanitized summary, not a filtered report. The actual incident, as experienced by 3 million people who've seen this video." He pressed play, and the room fell silent as Kylie Barnes's voice filled the space. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need you to move to economy class." The video played through the entire confrontation, Kylie's threats, Gavin Hart's condescension, Clayton Reed's entitled demands. The implicit and explicit racism woven through every interaction. Damien watched the executives' faces as they viewed the footage, seeing discomfort, embarrassment, and in some cases, what looked like genuine shock. When the video ended, Damien let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking. "That was me. Your majority owner, sitting in a first-class seat I'd paid for, being ordered to economy because a white executive decided he wanted my seat, and your crew decided I was disposable. Now imagine that happening to passengers who don't own the airline, passengers who don't have legal teams and PR departments, passengers who file complaints that get buried in bureaucracy and never result in consequences." He pulled up the next slide, the database he'd compiled overnight, showing discrimination complaints organized by type, frequency, and outcome. The numbers told a story that couldn't be denied or explained away. Hundreds of incidents, minimal discipline, a clear pattern of disparate treatment based on race. "This is what we've allowed to fester," Damien continued, his voice hard. "This is the culture we've tolerated, the behavior we've enabled through inadequate training and inconsistent enforcement, and this ends today." Robert Matthews, the CEO, cleared his throat. "Mr. Cross, I want to assure you we take these concerns seriously and we're prepared to implement appropriate remediation measures." "Stop," Damien interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I don't want corporate speak. I don't want assurances. I want accountability and action. Sharon, please share what you've compiled." Sharon Ortega stood, her hand steady as she distributed copies of her documentation to everyone in the room. Then she began walking through specific incidents, not statistics, but stories with names and dates and consequences that had destroyed passenger trust and damaged employee morale. She spoke for 20 minutes, her voice never wavering, and by the time she finished, several executives were visibly shaken. Patricia Gunderson from HR spoke up, her voice defensive. "Many of these incidents were investigated and resolved according to our established protocols." "Your protocols are inadequate," Damien said flatly. "They're designed to minimize liability rather than prevent discrimination. They prioritize crew member comfort over passenger dignity, and they've created a culture where employees believe they can treat black passengers differently without facing real consequences." He pulled up his reform proposal, the document he'd been refining all night. "Here's what's going to happen, effective immediately. First, every customer-facing employee will undergo comprehensive implicit bias training within the next 60 days. Not the generic online modules we've been using, but intensive in-person sessions facilitated by experts who specialize in aviation industry discrimination. Completion and competency testing are mandatory. Fail to complete or demonstrate understanding, and you're suspended without pay until you do. Diana Reyes, the CFO, leaned forward. That's going to cost millions in staff hours and training expenses. It's going to cost millions either way, Damien replied. We can spend it on training or on settlements and legal fees. I prefer the option that actually fixes the problem. He moved to the next slide. Second, we're establishing an independent office of civil rights compliance, reporting directly to me, with authority to investigate complaints, recommend discipline, and override local management decisions. Sharon Ortega will lead the LAX division and will establish similar positions at every major hub within 90 days. That's going to undermine operational authority, Robert Matthews objected. Station managers need autonomy to make real-time decisions. Station managers have proven they can't be trusted with that autonomy when it comes to discrimination complaints, Damien cut him off. So we're creating a system of checks and balances. You want that authority back? Prove you can exercise it responsibly. The room erupted into overlapping objections and concerns, executives talking over each other about operational challenges, union complications, and budget constraints. Damien let them talk for 60 seconds, then brought his hand down on the table hard enough to make coffee cups rattle. Enough, he said, and the room fell silent. I didn't call this meeting to debate whether we're going to implement these reforms. I called it to inform you that we are, and to give you the opportunity to be part of the solution or to remove yourselves from the process. This airline has a choice: evolve or die. There is no third option. Keisha Williams, the civil rights attorney on the board, spoke for the first time. Mr. Cross is right. Speaking as someone who studied airline discrimination for 20 years, I can tell you that Transcontinental is facing an inflection point. The video from Flight 447 has focused public attention in a way that won't fade quickly. We can either lead meaningful reform and potentially salvage the brand, or we can defend the status quo and watch this company become synonymous with discrimination. James Thornton, the retired airline executive who'd opposed reforms, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even if I accept that changes are necessary, and I'm not conceding they are to this extent, the timeline you're proposing is unrealistic. You can't retrain thousands of employees in 60 days. Watch me, Damien said simply. We'll hire additional trainers. We'll run sessions around the clock. We'll use every resource necessary. Because the alternative is continuing to harm passengers while we take our time implementing comfortable, gradual changes that won't actually solve anything. He pulled up the final slide of his presentation, a comprehensive timeline showing implementation phases, responsible parties, and measurable outcomes. This is happening. The only question is whether each of you is committed to making it succeed or whether you're going to be obstacles I need to remove. The bluntness of the statement hung in the air. Several executives exchanged glances, clearly calculating their options and finding them limited. Damien owned controlling interest, which meant he could replace any of them if they refused to cooperate. Fighting him would be career suicide, and everyone in the room knew it. Robert Matthews was the first to speak, his voice careful. I think I speak for the executive team when I say we understand the gravity of the situation and are prepared to implement the reforms you've outlined. However, I'd like to request regular review meetings to assess progress and address implementation challenges as they arise. Agreed, Damien said. Weekly progress reports direct to me, covering training completion rates, complaint statistics, and disciplinary actions. Transparency throughout. Patricia Gunderson from HR raised her hand tentatively. What about Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart? They're still suspended pending investigation. What's the plan for... They're terminated, Damien said flatly. Effective immediately, for cause. They violated company policy, federal regulations, and basic human decency. There will be no second chances, no probationary periods. Their actions yesterday demonstrated they're not capable of representing this airline. Their union is going to challenge that termination, Diana Reyes warned. Let them, Damien replied. We have video evidence, witness testimony, and documentation of policy violations. If their union wants to argue that racial discrimination is protected behavior, they're welcome to make that case publicly. He looked around the room, meeting each executive's eyes in turn. I want to be absolutely clear about something. What happened to me yesterday wasn't unique, it was just unusually well documented. This happens to passengers all the time, and we've allowed it because challenging it was uncomfortable and expensive. That ends now. Every employee of this airline, from baggage handlers to executives, needs to understand that discrimination will not be tolerated, minimized, or explained away. We're going to create a culture where people are valued, where dignity is non-negotiable, and where speaking up about injustice is rewarded rather than punished. Marcus Webb, who'd been silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. Mr. Cross, I appreciate everything you're saying, and I believe you mean it. But I need you to understand something. Ground staff and flight crews have heard promises about culture change before. We've sat through diversity training that didn't change anything. We've watched complaint systems get implemented and then ignored. For your reforms to work, employees need to see consistent follow-through, not just at the beginning when everyone's paying attention, but 6 months from now when the media has moved on to other stories. You're absolutely right, Damien acknowledged, which is why I'm committing to quarterly transparency reports showing complaint statistics, investigation outcomes, and disciplinary actions. These reports will be publicly available, not internal documents that stay hidden, but information that anyone can access and verify. If we're not following through, employees and passengers will be able to see it and hold us accountable. Lauren Chen's voice came through the video conference speakers. I'm sending everyone the final language for our reformed complaint system. Key features include anonymous reporting options, automatic investigation triggers, and protection from retaliation for employees who report discrimination they witness. We've also included provisions for compensating passengers who experience discrimination without requiring them to sign NDAs or waive their right to legal action. Wait, Diana Reyes said sharply. We're going to compensate passengers without requiring settlements or releases? That's financially insane. It's ethically necessary, Damien countered. And it's a statement that we're more interested in doing right by people we've wronged than in protecting ourselves from legal consequences. Yes, it creates liability exposure. It also creates trust, which is currently in very short supply. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, working through implementation details, assigning responsibilities, and establishing oversight mechanisms. By the time they broke for lunch, every executive in the room understood that their careers now depended on successfully implementing reforms that most of them had spent years avoiding. As the room emptied, Keisha Williams approached Damien, her expression mixing respect with curiosity. I've worked in civil rights law for 30 years, she said quietly. I've seen a lot of companies promise change after discrimination incidents. Very few actually deliver. What makes you different? Damien considered the question, thinking back to yesterday's humiliation, his father's lessons about dignity, the database of complaints he'd compiled that represented real human pain. Because I know what it feels like, he said simply. Not as an abstract concept, not as a legal liability, as lived experience. I know what it's like to be questioned about whether you belong somewhere, to have your humanity doubted, to face the constant low-grade discrimination that grinds you down over years. And I refuse to run a company that inflicts that on anyone else, regardless of what it costs or how uncomfortable it makes people who've benefited from the old system. Keisha nodded slowly. Then you might actually pull this off. But Damien, you're going to face resistance, not just from executives protecting their authority, but from crew members who've been operating one way for decades, from passengers who benefit from the current hierarchy, from board members who prioritize profit over principle. The easy thing would be to implement surface changes and declare victory. The hard thing is sustaining genuine reform when the initial outrage fades. I know, Damien said, but I didn't buy an airline to do easy things. Outside the conference room windows, Los Angeles spread toward the Pacific in a vast grid of streets and buildings, millions of people going about their days with no idea that in this boardroom, the blueprint for change had just been drawn. Whether that blueprint would transform into reality remained to be seen, but Damien felt something he hadn't felt since those first ventures in Detroit. The fierce certainty that came from knowing you were fighting for something that mattered, that the work itself was justification enough regardless of outcome. His phone buzzed with a message from Sharon Ortega. Kylie Barnes is requesting a meeting, says she wants to apologize. Do you want to see her? Damien stared at the message, feeling the familiar anger rise at the thought of facing the woman who'd humiliated him, then slowly typed his response. Yes, but not alone. I want witnesses, and I want it recorded. No private apologies that can be reframed later. Because accountability, he was learning, wasn't just about punishment. It was about truth that couldn't be denied, consequences that couldn't be minimized, and change that couldn't be reversed when attention moved elsewhere. And in a few hours, when Kylie Barnes walked into that room to face what she'd done, she would discover that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. They had to be replaced with entirely new structures, built on foundations of genuine understanding rather than comfortable denial. The meeting with Kylie Barnes was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the same conference room where the board meeting had taken place. But the atmosphere now felt different, heavier somehow, charged with the weight of reckoning that couldn't be avoided or postponed any longer. Damien arrived early, choosing a seat that put his back to the windows overlooking the city, wanting to see Kylie's face clearly when she walked in and confronted the consequences of her choices. Sharon Ortega arrived next, carrying a tablet and a legal pad, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes showing the strain of someone who'd been working nonstop since yesterday's incident. Behind her came Lauren Chen, who'd caught a morning flight from San Francisco specifically for this meeting, and Marcus Webb, who'd requested to attend as a witness representing ground staff who'd endured similar treatment over the years. Are we recording this? Lauren asked, setting up her laptop. Audio and video, Damien confirmed. Everything documented. If this goes anywhere legal, I want a complete record. At precisely 2 o'clock, Kylie Barnes entered the conference room, and Damien felt a jolt of something complicated at seeing her again. Not quite satisfaction, not quite sympathy, something that landed in the uncomfortable space between vindication and recognition of shared humanity. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in civilian clothes without the armor of her uniform, her face pale and drawn with sleepless circles under her eyes. Behind her walked a union representative, a compact woman in her 40s named Gloria Hendricks, who carried a briefcase and wore the wary expression of someone walking into a battle she knew she'd already lost. Kylie's eyes found Damien's and held for a moment before dropping to the floor, unable to sustain contact. She took the seat Sharon indicated across the table from Damien, her hands twisting together in her lap with the same nervous gesture she'd displayed at the gate yesterday. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Mr. Cross, Gloria began, her voice professionally cordial. My client wanted an opportunity to let her speak for herself, Damien interrupted, his tone not unkind but absolutely firm. She found her voice easily enough when she was ordering me out of my seat. She can use it now. Gloria's jaw tightened, but she nodded and looked at Kylie, who took a shaky breath before finally raising her eyes to meet Damien's gaze. I'm sorry, Kylie said, and her voice cracked on the words. I'm so sorry for what I did yesterday, for how I treated you, for the assumptions I made, for all of it. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I know that now. The apology hung in the air, and Damien let it sit there, examining it from all angles the way he'd examine a contract proposal, looking for sincerity versus self-preservation, genuine understanding versus fear of consequences. Kylie shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, waiting for absolution that didn't come. What exactly are you apologizing for? Damien asked finally. Be specific. Kylie blinked, clearly not expecting the question. I apologize for asking you to move from your seat, for threatening you when you questioned my authority, for... Why did you ask me to move? Damien interrupted. Because Mr. Reed wanted that seat. No. Why me, specifically? There were other passengers in first class. Why was I the one you approached? The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Kylie's eyes darted to Gloria, seeking guidance, but the union representative could only shake her head slightly. This question required an answer that no one else could provide. I don't know, Kylie whispered finally. Yes, you do, Damien said, his voice still measured but now carrying an edge that made Kylie flinch. You might not want to say it out loud, you might not have been consciously aware of it in the moment, but you know. So I'm going to ask you again, why me? Kylie's face crumpled, tears spilling over despite obvious efforts to maintain composure. Because when I saw you sitting there, my first thought was that you probably weren't supposed to be in first class. that you were probably using miles or got upgraded somehow, and that made you easier to move. Less important than a paying customer who'd specifically requested that seat. Even though my boarding pass clearly showed a paid first-class fare? I didn't really look at it that closely, Kylie admitted, her voice barely audible. I made assumptions based on looking at you, and those assumptions were racist, and I'm so deeply ashamed of that. It was, Damien reflected, probably the most honest thing she'd said since entering the room. Not the prepared apology, not the corporate language about inappropriate behavior, but the raw admission that she judged him based on race and found him wanting, found him disposable, found him less deserving of the space he occupied than a white executive who decided he wanted it. "Do you understand what you did to me?" Damien asked, his voice dropping to something quieter, but no less intense. Not just the inconvenience of being moved to a worse seat, but the fundamental violation of being told, in front of 100 people, that I didn't belong where I had every right to be? Of having my dignity stripped away because you decided, based on nothing but your prejudices, that I was less valuable than Clayton Reed? Kylie nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I do understand, or at least I'm trying to. I've spent the last day reading about discrimination, about implicit bias, about the history of Black Americans being excluded from spaces they had every right to occupy. I know I can't fully understand what it felt like for you, but I'm trying to learn. Why now?" Marcus Webb spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet intensity. "Why are you trying to learn now, after you got caught and suspended? Where was this desire to understand when you were putting on your uniform every day and interacting with passengers who looked like Mr. Cross?" Kylie turned to face Marcus, seemingly startled by the intervention. I thought I was doing my job correctly. I went through all the training, I passed all the competency tests. I thought treating everyone with respect meant following policies and accommodating our elite members. Did the training tell you to assume Black passengers don't belong in first class? Marcus pressed. Did the policies say to question our ticket validity more aggressively? Or did you add those interpretations yourself based on biases you never examined? I didn't think I was biased, Kylie said desperately. I have Black friends. I voted for... She stopped herself, seeming to realize how hollow those defenses sounded. Everyone has Black friends, Marcus said, his tone weary with the exhaustion of hearing the same excuse repeated endlessly. Everyone voted for the right candidate. Everyone thinks they're not racist because they define racism as burning crosses and using slurs, not as the everyday assumptions and microaggressions that actually do most of the damage. Sharon Ortega leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Kylie, I want to ask you something. Over the years you've worked for Transcontinental, how many times have you questioned a white passenger's right to be in first class? Kylie started to answer, then stopped, her brow furrowing as she actually considered the question. I'm not sure. Take your time. Think about it. Kylie sat in silence for a long moment, and Damien watched understanding dawn slowly across her face, the uncomfortable recognition of a pattern she'd never consciously noticed but couldn't now deny. I don't think I ever have, she said finally, her voice small. Questioned a white passenger, I mean. Even when their boarding passes showed economy and they'd wandered into first class by mistake, I'd just politely redirect them. But with passengers of color, with Black passengers especially, I realize now that I did approach those situations differently. More suspicion, less benefit of the doubt. Why? Sharon asked simply. Because, Kylie struggled with the answer, her face showing the difficulty of articulating beliefs that had operated beneath conscious thought. Because some part of me, some part I didn't even know was there, assumed they were more likely to be in the wrong place, to not really belong, to be trying to get away with something. The admission settled over the room like a heavy fog. Gloria Hendricks shifted uncomfortably, clearly unhappy with how much her client was revealing, but unable to intervene when Kylie was speaking voluntarily. Lauren Chen spoke for the first time, her lawyer's voice cutting cleanly through the emotional density. Ms. Barnes, do you understand that what you just described is the textbook definition of racial profiling? That those assumptions, however unconscious, constitute discrimination under federal law and company policy? Yes, Kylie whispered. I understand that now. What? And do you understand that understanding it now doesn't undo the harm you caused? Lauren continued. That Mr. Cross and countless other passengers have been subjected to that discrimination, and that your awareness of your biases comes too late to protect them from the damage? Yes, I understand that too. Damien had remained quiet through this exchange, watching Kylie wrestle with truths she'd spent her adult life avoiding. Part of him, the part that had been humiliated yesterday, that carried the accumulated weight of 1,000 similar moments across his lifetime, wanted her to hurt more, wanted her to fully feel the consequences of casual racism that had been invisible to her until it destroyed her career. But another part, the part his father had cultivated through years of patient teaching, recognized that genuine awareness was rare enough to be valuable, that Kylie's discomfort right now was potentially the beginning of real growth, rather than just the performance of remorse calculated to minimize punishment. Kylie, he said, and she turned back to face him with something like relief at hearing her name instead of Ms. Barnes. I believe you're sorry. I believe you're beginning to understand what you did, but I want you to understand something else. Your apology doesn't obligate me to forgive you, and your awareness doesn't erase the consequences of your actions. I know, Kylie said, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for my job back. I know that's not possible after what I did. I wanted you to know that I'm not the person I was yesterday, that I'm going to spend the rest of my life being better, doing better, and I'm sorry it took this to make me see what I should have seen all along. Gloria Hendricks cleared her throat. Mr. Cross, the union recognizes that Ms. Barnes violated company policy. However, we would like to request consideration of the fact that she's been with Transcontinental for 3 years with no prior disciplinary issues, and that the training she received may not have adequately prepared her to recognize and address her implicit biases. Stop, Damien said, raising one hand. I understand the union's obligation to represent its members, Ms. Hendricks, but let's be clear about something. Inadequate training is a systemic problem that we're addressing. It doesn't excuse individual choices. Kylie didn't fail because she lacked information. She failed because she made assumptions based on race and then threatened me when I challenged those assumptions. Those were active choices, not passive failures of preparation. Nevertheless, Gloria persisted, termination is a severe consequence, and we believe suspension with mandatory retraining would be more appropriate. No. The word was absolute. Kylie is terminated for cause, and that decision is final. What happened yesterday wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a demonstration of values incompatible with the culture we're building. I won't allow the union to negotiate her back into a position where she can harm other passengers. Gloria's expression hardened. Then the union will pursue formal grievance procedures. Pursue whatever you want, Damien said, his voice flat. We have video evidence, witness testimony, and Kylie's own admission. If you want to argue that racial discrimination should be protected by union contracts, make that case publicly and see how it goes. The silence that followed was tense, Gloria clearly calculating whether pursuing this grievance would hurt the union more than help their member. Kylie, for her part, had gone very still, staring at her hands with the hollow expression of someone watching their future collapse in real time. Can I ask one question? Kylie said quietly. Damien nodded. Would you have fired me if I'd done the same thing to a white passenger? If I'd asked them to move for Clayton Reed, same circumstances, just different skin color? It was a good question, the kind that cut to the heart of whether this was about accountability or vengeance. Damien considered it carefully before answering. Yes, he said finally, because the core violation wasn't just the racism, though that's certainly the most damaging aspect. The core violation was removing a passenger from a confirmed seat without policy justification, threatening them when they questioned that removal, and prioritizing another passenger's preference over someone's paid accommodation. That's unacceptable regardless of race, but the racial element makes it exponentially worse because it reveals a pattern of discriminatory decision-making that can't be tolerated in any customer-facing employee. He paused, then added, "The difference is, you wouldn't have done it to a white passenger. That's the whole point. You made a choice based on race, and that choice revealed biases that make you unsuitable for this work. Not forever, maybe. People can grow, can change, can become better than they were. But not here. Not in a position where you have power over passengers who look like me. Those passengers deserve crew members who don't need to be taught that black people belong in first class. Kylie absorbed this, tears still tracking silently down her face, and nodded once. I understand. And for what it's worth, I hope the changes you're making help other people see their biases before they cause the kind of harm I caused. I hope they're better than I was. Sharon Ortega, who'd been quietly taking notes throughout the exchange, looked up. Kylie, I want to ask you something. If you could go back to yesterday, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? Kylie didn't hesitate. I would have told Mr. Reed that seat 2A was occupied by a passenger with a confirmed reservation and offered him a different first-class seat. I would have recognized that loyalty status doesn't trump confirmed bookings, and I would have examined my immediate assumption that the passenger in that seat was somehow less entitled to it than Mr. Reed wanted to be. That's the right answer, Sharon said. But it's the answer you should have known yesterday before you violated Mr. Cross's rights. The fact that you know it now is evidence of growth, but it doesn't undo the damage. Marcus Webb leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Can I ask you something, Kylie? Not as an airline representative, just as someone who's been on the receiving end of this treatment. Do you have any idea how many times this has happened? How many passengers have been treated differently, moved inappropriately, questioned unnecessarily, all because crew members made the same assumptions you made? I don't know, Kylie said, but I'm guessing it's a lot more than I ever realized. It's constant, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience. It's the flight attendant who immediately assumes I'm in the wrong seat. It's the gate agent who scrutinizes my boarding pass twice as long as the white passenger ahead of me. It's the pilot who does a double take when I board in uniform because he doesn't expect to see a black gate coordinator. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and every single one of those cuts comes from someone who probably thinks they're not racist, who has black friends and voted for the right candidate. He met Kylie's eyes directly. You were part of that system. You contributed to that harm. And while I appreciate that you're beginning to understand what you did, I want you to really sit with the scale of it. Not just what you did to Mr. Cross yesterday, but what you've probably been doing in smaller ways throughout your entire time with this airline. Kylie looked stricken, but she nodded. I will. I promise I will. Lauren Chen glanced at her watch, then at Damien. We should move on to the next meeting. Clayton Reed and his attorney are scheduled for 3 o'clock. The mention of Clayton Reed seemed to pull everyone back from the emotional intensity of the past hour. Gloria Hendricks stood, gathering her materials with brisk efficiency, clearly eager to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere. Kylie rose more slowly, her movements carrying the weight of someone who'd been fundamentally altered by the past 24 hours. At the door, she turned back. Mr. Cross, I know this probably doesn't matter to you, but I want you to know that I'm going to be different going forward. Better. And if there's ever anything I can do to help with the reforms you're implementing, if you need someone to talk to other crew members about recognizing their biases, I'd be willing to do that. Damien studied her for a long moment. I'll keep that in mind. But Kylie, the best thing you can do right now is work on yourself. Really examine your assumptions, your biases, the beliefs you've never questioned. Become the person who would never treat someone the way you treated me. And maybe, years from now, when you've done that work, you can help others do the same. But it has to start with genuine transformation, not just performative awareness. I understand, Kylie said softly. Thank you for giving me the chance to apologize, even though I didn't deserve it. After she and Gloria left, the room sat in heavy silence for several minutes. Sharon Ortega spoke first, her voice thoughtful. That was harder to watch than I expected. She genuinely seems to understand what she did wrong. Understanding and change aren't the same thing, Marcus said quietly. I've seen a lot of people understand their biases in the moment of consequences, then go right back to operating the same way once the pressure's off. Which is why we're building systems that don't rely on individual transformation, Damien said. Kylie's awareness is valuable, but it came too late to save her job or undo the harm she caused. The reforms we're implementing are designed to catch discrimination before it happens, not just punish it after the fact. Lauren was already pulling up documents for the next meeting on her laptop. Speaking of which, Clayton Reed's attorney called this morning. They're trying to frame this as a misunderstanding, claiming that Mr. Reed legitimately believed he had medical priority for that seat. Do they have documentation? No, and I've already informed them that we have Mr. Reed on video making statements that suggest his request was based on perceived status rather than medical necessity. The attorney's trying to negotiate a settlement that would prevent us from pursuing action against Reed or his company. What did you tell them? Lauren smiled grimly. I told them to bring their best offer to this afternoon's meeting, but that Mr. Cross isn't particularly interested in settlements that let discrimination slide in exchange for financial consideration. At 3 o'clock precisely, Clayton Reed entered the conference room looking like a man who'd spent the past 24 hours being extensively counseled by lawyers. Gone was the aggressive entitlement from yesterday, replaced by a carefully constructed mask of professional courtesy. His attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Michelle Voss, carried herself with the predatory alertness of someone accustomed to hostile negotiations. Clayton didn't immediately sit, instead extending his hand toward Damien with a practiced smile. Mr. Cross, I believe we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I'd like to apologize for any misunderstanding. Sit down, Mr. Reed, Damien said without accepting the handshake. And understand something before we begin. I'm not interested in the performance of civility. You're here because your actions yesterday contributed to my humiliation and exposed this airline to substantial liability. So let's skip the pleasantries and address what actually happened. Clayton's smile faltered, but he took his seat, Michelle Voss settling beside him with a legal pad, and an expression that suggested she'd anticipated this wouldn't go smoothly. Mr. Cross, Michelle began, her voice professionally smooth, my client acknowledges that there was an unfortunate incident yesterday regarding seat assignments. However, Mr. Reed acted in good faith based on information provided by airline crew, and he had a legitimate medical need for the specific seat in question. Show me the medical documentation, Damien interrupted. Michelle blinked. I'm sorry? The medical documentation that justified removing me from my seat. Federal regulations are very specific about disability accommodations. And if Mr. Reed had a legitimate medical need, there should be documentation from a healthcare provider specifying the required accommodation. Show it to me. Michelle and Clayton exchanged glances, and in that moment of hesitation, everyone in the room understood the truth. There was no documentation because there was no legitimate medical need. The specific medical details are protected by privacy regulations. Michelle began. No, they're not, Lauren Chen cut in crisply. When a passenger claims medical necessity for a specific accommodation that requires displacing another passenger, they waive privacy protections for the relevant documentation. The airline has a legal right, actually, a legal obligation, to verify the claim before taking action. So either produce the documentation or we'll proceed on the assumption that Mr. Reed lied about medical necessity to fraudulently obtain another passenger's seat. Clayton's face flushed red. Now wait just a minute. Did you or did you not falsely claim medical necessity for seat 2A? Damien asked bluntly. I have legitimate back issues that are aggravated by certain seating positions. That's not what I asked. Did you have medical documentation specifically requiring seat 2A? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Michelle touched Clayton's arm, a warning gesture, but he was already too far committed to retreat gracefully. I didn't think I needed formal documentation for what was essentially a courtesy accommodation for a Platinum Elite member, Clayton said, his tone defensive. I've been flying with Transcontinental for years, and the crew has always been willing to accommodate my preferences. Your preferences, Damien repeated slowly. Not your medical needs. Your preferences. You wanted my seat, so you claim medical necessity to force the crew to give it to you. And when I questioned that decision, you suggested I should know my place in economy. I never said anything about race. You didn't have to, Marcus Webb said, speaking for the first time since Clayton entered. When you told Mr. Cross that economy builds character and helps you appreciate comfort, when you assumed he should be grateful for whatever accommodation you allowed him, you were making your assumptions very clear. Michelle Voss clearly recognized they were losing ground rapidly. Mr. Cross, I think we can all agree that the situation yesterday was handled poorly by multiple parties. My client is prepared to offer a formal apology and substantial compensation if we can resolve this matter without further escalation. What's your company's current contract value with Transcontinental Airways? Damien asked Clayton directly. Clayton looked confused by the question. I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. Michelle consulted her notes. Reed Industries currently has preferred vendor agreements with Transcontinental valued at approximately $8 million annually, covering executive travel management and corporate booking services. That contract comes up for renewal next quarter, Damien said. And I'm suddenly very interested in reviewing the terms, particularly the clauses about ethical conduct and discrimination in service delivery. The color drained from Clayton's face as he realized the full scope of potential consequences. This wasn't just about personal embarrassment anymore. This threatened his company's revenue, his professional reputation, potentially his position as an executive if the board decided he'd created unnecessary liability. Mr. Cross, Michelle said carefully, I don't think it's appropriate to mix a personal incident with corporate contracting decisions. Why not? Damien asked. Mr. Reed certainly mixed his corporate status with his behavior yesterday. He specifically told crew members he was a senior executive with one of the airline's corporate partners, and he leveraged that relationship to pressure them into violating my rights. If he can use business relationships as a weapon, I can certainly consider those relationships when evaluating whether Reed Industries shares the values we're trying to cultivate. Clayton leaned forward, desperation beginning to show through his professional veneer. Look, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have pushed for your seat, and I shouldn't have made those comments. I apologize. But I've worked my entire career to build Reed Industries, and I'm asking you not to let one bad moment destroy everything I've accomplished. One bad moment, Damien repeated, his voice cold. That's what you're calling it? Not a pattern of entitled behavior that assumed a black man in first class must be disposable? Not a demonstration of values that prioritized your comfort over someone else's dignity? Just one bad moment? I'm not a racist, Clayton protested. I employ people of all backgrounds. I support diversity initiatives. Do you know how many times I've heard that defense? Marcus interrupted. From people who employ black workers in subordinate positions while assuming black customers don't belong in premium spaces? From people who support diversity as an abstract concept while treating individual people of color with suspicion and contempt? Supporting diversity initiatives doesn't mean anything if your actual behavior contradicts those values. Sharon Ortega pulled out her tablet. Mr. Reed, I've pulled your travel history with Transcontinental. In the past 2 years, you've filed complaints about seat assignments 7 times. In 6 of those cases, the passenger you wanted removed from your preferred seat was a person of color. In 5 cases, crew members accommodated your request. Does that sound like one bad moment, or does it sound like a pattern? Clayton's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. Michelle Voss looked like she'd been struck, clearly having not known this information before agreeing to represent Clayton in this meeting. Those passengers were removed from their seats, Damien said, his voice carrying barely controlled fury. 6 people who had every right to sit where they'd been assigned, forced to move because you decided you were more important than they were. How many of them filed complaints, Mr. Reed? How many of them just accepted the humiliation because fighting seemed too exhausting or too risky? I wasn't thinking about it in racial terms, Clayton said weakly. Those seats were available and I wanted them. Those seats weren't available, Lauren corrected sharply. They were occupied by passengers with confirmed reservations. You simply assumed those particular passengers would be easy to displace, and you were right, because crew members shared your assumptions about who really deserved premium accommodations. Michelle Voss had clearly heard enough. She closed her portfolio with a snap, her professional composure cracking. Mr. Reed, I'm advising you to stop talking. Mr. Cross, my client is prepared to accept any reasonable consequence for his actions yesterday, including a formal apology, financial compensation, and voluntary suspension of his elite status. But I'm asking you to separate personal accountability from corporate retaliation. Reed Industries employs 300 people who had nothing to do with this incident. You're right, Damien said, surprising everyone. Reed Industries employees don't deserve to suffer for their CEO's behavior, which is why I'm not canceling the contract. I'm renegotiating it. Michelle's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means the contract continues, but Mr. Reed is permanently banned from using Transcontinental Airways for any purpose, business, or personal. He'll need to find alternative travel arrangements. Additionally, Reed Industries will implement mandatory bias training for all executives, developed and delivered by consultants of our choosing, with the airline retaining audit rights to ensure compliance. Finally, Reed Industries will contribute $100,000 to the scholarship fund we're establishing for students from underrepresented communities pursuing aviation careers. That's extortion, Clayton burst out. That's accountability, Damien countered. And it's a generous offer considering the alternative is terminating the contract entirely and filing a civil suit for the harm your behavior caused. You have 48 hours to accept these terms. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with litigation. Michelle's calculating expression suggested she was already advising Clayton to take the deal. The financial cost was significant but survivable. The training requirement would actually help Reed Industries avoid future discrimination issues. And maintaining the contract, even with Clayton banned from using the airline, was infinitely preferable to losing $8 million in annual revenue. Clayton, however, looked like a man watching his self-image crumble. The entitled executive who'd strolled into first class yesterday, demanding another man's seat, had been replaced by someone forced to confront consequences he'd never imagined facing. "Fine," he said finally, the word bitter. "I'll accept your terms." "In writing," Lauren specified. "Signed agreement within 48 hours or the offer is void." Michelle nodded. "We'll have it to you by tomorrow morning." As they gathered their materials to leave, Damien spoke once more. "Mr. Reed, I want you to understand something. The reason you're facing these consequences isn't because you got caught. It's because what you did was fundamentally wrong and would have been wrong even if I'd been someone without the power to hold you accountable. You used your status and your corporate relationships as weapons to harm someone you considered beneath you. That's not a mistake. That's a choice that reveals character. I hope losing access to this airline, paying these penalties, and undergoing bias training helps you become better than that. But even if it doesn't, at least the passengers who fly transcontinental won't have to deal with you anymore." Clayton's face worked through several expressions: anger, shame, resentment, and perhaps the earliest stirrings of genuine reflection. He left without responding, Michelle Voss following with the brisk efficiency of an attorney already planning damage control. After the door closed, Marcus Webb let out a long breath. That was satisfying to watch. "It was necessary," Damien corrected, "but I don't know if it was enough. Reed will go through the training, pay the money, accept the ban, but will he actually change? Or will he just be more careful about hiding his biases next time?" "Does it matter?" Sharon asked. "You've neutralized his ability to harm passengers on this airline. You've created financial consequences that will make other executives think twice before pulling similar stunts. And you've established a precedent for holding people accountable. That's significant regardless of whether Clayton Reed personally experiences a moral awakening." "She's right," Lauren agreed. "We can't control whether people genuinely change their beliefs. We can only control the systems that limit their ability to act on those beliefs and ensure consequences when they do. That's what today accomplished." Damien nodded, but he felt the familiar exhaustion settling over him, not just physical tiredness from 48 hours with minimal sleep, but the deeper weariness that came from fighting battles that shouldn't need to be fought, from having to constantly prove that discrimination was real and wrong and worthy of consequences. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. Press conference scheduled for 5 p.m. at the LAX Media Center. All major outlets confirmed attendance. Talking points ready for review. The final piece of today's accountability. Not just private meetings and internal reforms, but a public statement that would define how this incident lived in collective memory. Damien glanced at the clock. 90 minutes to prepare for the moment when Flight 447 stopped being a viral video and became either a cautionary tale about discrimination or a blueprint for meaningful change. The outcome depended entirely on what he said next and how he said it. The exhaustion would have to wait. The rest, the processing of everything that had happened, the personal healing from humiliation, all of that would have to wait. Because right now, 3 million people who'd watched him be degraded were waiting to see if justice was possible, if accountability was real, if speaking up mattered. And Damien Cross, CEO and majority owner of Transcontinental Airways, had 90 minutes to show them it did. The LAX Media Center was packed beyond capacity by the time Damien arrived at 4:45, camera crews jockeying for position, while reporters checked equipment and reviewed notes on phones and tablets. The room hummed with anticipatory energy, the collective awareness that this press conference would either vindicate the millions who'd watched Flight 447 unfold online, or become another disappointing example of corporate damage control masquerading as accountability. Lauren Chen met Damien at the entrance, pressing a folder of prepared talking points into his hands. I've drafted responses to the likely questions, but honestly, after watching you handle Kylie Barnes and Clayton Reed today, I think you should just speak from the heart. The prepared statements sound too corporate. Good, Damien said, handing the folder back. Because I'm tired of corporate speak. These people don't need polish. They need truth. Sharon Ortega stood near the podium, coordinating with Transcontinental's PR director, a perpetually anxious man named David Chen, who looked like he'd aged a decade since yesterday. When he saw Damien approaching, David hurried over with obvious relief. Mr. Cross, thank you for doing this. The media interest is unprecedented. We've got CNN, ABC, NBC, all the major outlets, plus about 50 print journalists and more streaming outlets than I can count. I've prepared an opening statement that acknowledges the incident while emphasizing our commitment to customer service. No prepared statement, Damien said, adjusting his tie in front of a mirror someone had propped against the wall. I'm going to speak directly about what happened, what we're doing about it, and why it matters. David's face went pale. Mr. Cross, with respect, unscripted remarks in this kind of high-stakes situation carry significant risk. One wrong word, one statement that can be taken out of context. David, Damien interrupted, meeting the PR director's eyes with calm certainty. I was humiliated on camera in front of millions of people because an airline I own tolerates discrimination. The risk isn't what I might say unscripted. The risk is saying nothing that actually matters because we're too worried about controlling the narrative. At precisely 5 o'clock, Damien walked to the podium, the camera flashes immediate and blinding, reporters leaning forward in their seats with pens ready and recorders extended. He took a moment to survey the room, making eye contact with several journalists, acknowledging the weight of this moment before speaking. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Yesterday, I boarded Transcontinental Airways Flight 447 from Chicago to Los Angeles. I was seated in first class, seat 2A, which I'd paid for. Before the plane took off, a flight attendant named Kylie Barnes ordered me to move to economy class to accommodate another passenger who wanted my seat. When I asked about the policy justification for this demand, I was threatened with removal from the aircraft. When I continued to ask questions, I was told by a senior flight attendant that the other passenger was a Platinum Elite member with corporate connections and that I should understand this was just business. He paused, letting the facts settle. The room was utterly silent except for the soft whir of cameras. The other passenger was Clayton Reed, a white executive who claimed medical necessity for my specific seat but had no documentation to support that claim. I was eventually forced to relocate to economy class, where I spent the flight documenting what had happened and preparing for this moment. What neither the crew members nor Mr. Reed knew was that I'm Damien Cross, CEO of Crosswell Group, which owns controlling interest in Transcontinental Airways. They didn't know because they never asked who I was. They just looked at me and decided I didn't belong in first class. A reporter in the front row raised her hand, but Damien shook his head gently. I'll take questions in a moment, but I need to say some things first. What happened to me yesterday wasn't unique. It wasn't an isolated incident or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was the predictable result of a corporate culture that tolerates discrimination, provides inadequate training, and fails to enforce consequences when crew members treat passengers differently based on race. He pulled out his phone, displaying the database he'd compiled. Since taking ownership of this airline 3 months ago, I've been investigating patterns of discriminatory treatment. In the past year alone, we've received over 200 formal complaints from passengers who were questioned about their ticket legitimacy, removed from seats inappropriately, or subjected to enhanced scrutiny because of their race. Those are just the formal complaints. The real number, including incidents that went unreported because passengers didn't think anything would change, is likely 10 times higher. Marcus Webb, standing near the side wall, nodded almost imperceptibly, his expression validating every word. I'm here today to announce comprehensive reforms that will fundamentally change how Transcontinental Airways operates. Effective immediately, Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart, the flight attendants involved in yesterday's incident, have been terminated for cause. This wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. Their actions demonstrated values incompatible with the culture we're building. Several reporters began typing furiously, but Damien continued without pause. Clayton Reed has been permanently banned from flying Transcontinental Airways, and his company's contract has been renegotiated to include mandatory bias training and a significant contribution to our new scholarship fund. Mr. Reed used his corporate status as a weapon to displace me, and he's done the same thing to at least 6 other passengers over the past 2 years. That pattern ends now. A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise mixing with approval. But individual accountability isn't enough. We're implementing system-wide changes designed to prevent discrimination rather than just punish it after the fact. Every customer-facing employee will undergo comprehensive implicit bias training within 60 days. This isn't generic online modules. This is intensive, in-person sessions facilitated by experts, with competency testing and mandatory completion. We're establishing an independent office of civil rights compliance with direct reporting to me, with authority to investigate complaints and override local management decisions. We're creating real-time reporting mechanisms that protect employees who speak up about discrimination they witness. And we're publishing quarterly transparency reports showing complaint statistics, investigation outcomes, and disciplinary actions. He looked directly at the cameras, knowing millions would watch this footage. I'm also announcing a $10 million scholarship fund for students from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation. This industry has historically excluded people of color from leadership positions, and we're going to help change that. We're partnering with civil rights organizations to develop and review our training materials, ensuring they reflect best practices rather than corporate convenience. And we're forming an independent advisory board with real authority to review policies and recommend changes. Lauren Chen, watching from the side, smiled slightly. Everything he was saying aligned with what they'd planned, but hearing him deliver it with such conviction made the commitments feel more real, more binding than any legal document could achieve. Now I want to address something directly, Damien continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Some people will say I'm overreacting, that what happened yesterday was just a customer service failure that's being blown out of proportion because of who I am. They'll say discrimination isn't really that common, that I'm playing the race card, that I'm damaging this airline's reputation by talking openly about these problems. He paused, letting the anticipated criticisms hang in the air. To those people, I say this: I am the majority owner of this airline. If I wanted to hide what happened, I could have resolved it quietly, taken some compensation, and moved on with my life. The fact that I'm standing here instead should tell you something about how serious this problem is. Discrimination isn't rare. It's constant. It's the daily experience of millions of people who don't have the platform or power to demand accountability. And the only way it gets better is if people like me, who do have power, choose to use it on behalf of everyone who doesn't. A black woman in the third row was openly crying, and several other journalists looked visibly moved. This wasn't the usual corporate press conference with carefully sanitized messaging. This was raw testimony about lived experience, delivered by someone who'd been humiliated publicly and was now channeling that humiliation into systemic change. I also want to say something to the crew members and employees of Transcontinental Airways who've witnessed discrimination, who felt uncomfortable with how certain passengers were treated, but who didn't know how to speak up or whether it would matter. It matters. Your voices matter. The reforms we're implementing include protection from retaliation, anonymous reporting options, and real investigation of complaints. If you see discrimination, if you experience it, if you have information about patterns we need to address, I want to hear from you. Not through filtered HR channels, but directly. He gave out an email address that Lauren had set up specifically for this purpose, one that would come directly to the Civil Rights Compliance Office rather than getting lost in corporate bureaucracy. Now I'll take questions, Damien said, and dozens of hands shot up immediately. He pointed to a reporter from CNN in the front row, a middle-aged black man whose press badge identified him as Jerome Williams. Mr. Cross, you mentioned that Ms. Barnes and Mr. Hart have been terminated. Their union has indicated they may file grievances. Are you concerned about legal challenges to these terminations? No, Damien said simply. We have video evidence, witness testimony, and documentation of clear policy violations. If their union wants to argue that racial discrimination should be protected by labor contracts, they're welcome to make that case. But I'm confident that when arbitrators review the evidence, they'll uphold these terminations. A white woman from the New York Times stood next. You've announced very aggressive reforms with tight timelines. Some industry analysts are saying this is unrealistic, that you're setting yourself up for failure. How do you respond? I respond by asking what the alternative is, Damien said. Should we take 5 years to gradually implement changes while passengers continue to experience discrimination? Should we prioritize operational convenience over human dignity? These reforms are ambitious because the problem is severe. Yes, implementation will be challenging. Yes, it will cost money and require significant effort. But the cost of continuing to harm passengers is higher, morally, financially, and reputationally. A young Asian woman from NBC raised her hand. Mr. Cross, you mentioned that you've been flying transcontinental routes anonymously for months, documenting problems. Were you looking for an excuse to implement these reforms? Or did yesterday's incident genuinely surprise you? It was a sharp question, and Damien respected the journalist for asking it. Yesterday surprised me in its brazenness, but not in its occurrence. I knew discrimination was happening. I'd seen it in complaint records, heard about it from employees, observed smaller incidents during my flights. What surprised me was the comfort level with which Ms. Barnes and Mr. Hart operated, the assumption that they could violate my rights openly and face no consequences. That told me the culture was even worse than I'd documented, because they clearly believed discrimination was normal and acceptable. Jerome Williams stood again. Can you talk about the emotional impact of what happened? You're describing this very clinically, but you were humiliated in front of hundreds of people. How does that feel? Damien took a breath, allowing himself to access emotions he'd kept locked down for the past 30 hours. It feels like every other time I've been made to feel unwelcome in spaces I had every right to occupy, like being followed in department stores as a teenager, like having colleagues assume I was there to fix the computers instead of led the meeting, like watching white peers be given opportunities I had to fight twice as hard to earn. What happened yesterday was particularly public, but the underlying experience, being judged inadequate based on skin color, that's not new. That's been my reality, and the reality of millions of people of color for our entire lives. His voice roughened slightly. The difference is, yesterday I had the power to demand accountability. Most people don't. They absorb the humiliation, file complaints that go nowhere, tell themselves it's not worth fighting. I'm doing this not just for me, but for everyone who's experienced this and been told to just accept it. The room was completely silent now, the usual press conference energy replaced by something deeper, recognition of truth that couldn't be denied or minimized. A Latino man from the LA Times asked, "What about passengers who've experienced discrimination on transcontinental in the past? Are you offering any recourse for them?" "Yes," Damien said. "We're establishing a dedicated process for reviewing past discrimination complaints, including cases that were resolved inadequately or dismissed inappropriately. Passengers who believe they experienced discrimination can submit their cases for review, and where we find that discrimination occurred, we'll provide compensation without requiring NDAs or liability releases. This isn't about protecting the airline. This is about making things right with people we've wronged." Lauren's eyebrows rose slightly. They hadn't specifically discussed this element, but she was already mentally drafting the legal framework to make it happen safely. Sharon Ortega raised her hand, surprising everyone by stepping forward to the microphone. "I'd like to add something, if I may," she said, glancing at Damien for permission. He nodded and stepped aside slightly, making room. "I'm Sharon Ortega, station manager at LAX. I've worked for Transcontinental for 8 years, and I need to acknowledge something publicly. I've been part of the problem Mr. Cross is describing. I've received discrimination complaints. I've investigated incidents, and while I believed I was handling them appropriately, the truth is I prioritized operational smoothness over passenger dignity. I accepted incremental changes when what was needed was fundamental reform. I convinced myself that slow progress was better than no progress, when really I was just avoiding the discomfort of challenging a broken culture. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of genuine reflection. Mr. Cross is giving me an opportunity to be part of the solution, and I'm grateful for that. But I also want other managers, other supervisors, other employees who've witnessed discrimination and stayed silent. I want you to know that acknowledging our failures is the first step toward fixing them. We've been complicit, and that ends now. The admission was remarkable in its honesty, and several reporters looked genuinely surprised. Corporate figures rarely admitted culpability this directly, especially not in public forums. David Chen, the PR director, looked like he might have a heart attack, but Damien smiled slightly and reclaimed the microphone. That's the kind of leadership we need. People willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths and commit to doing better. Sharon could have stayed quiet, protected herself, avoided any admission of past failures. Instead, she chose accountability. That's the culture we're building. A white man from Fox News stood, his expression skeptical. Mr. Cross, some critics are saying this is political correctness gone too far, that you're destroying careers over what amounts to a seating dispute. How do you respond to accusations that you're being vindictive rather than constructive? Damien met his gaze directly. I respond by pointing out that political correctness is often just a phrase people use when they want to avoid accountability for discrimination. What happened yesterday wasn't a seating dispute. It was racial profiling. Ms. Barnes and Mr. Hart didn't lose their jobs because of one mistake. They lost their jobs because they demonstrated values incompatible with treating all passengers with dignity. If that's controversial, if expecting airline employees not to racially profile passengers is somehow politically divisive, then we have much bigger problems than I thought. The reporter pressed further. But don't you think termination is excessive? Couldn't suspension and retraining have achieved the same goal? No, Damien said flatly, because the goal isn't just punishing Ms. Barnes and Mr. Hart. It's sending an unmistakable message to every employee of this airline that discrimination has immediate and severe consequences. Suspension and retraining suggests this is a correctable behavior problem. It's not. It's a fundamental values misalignment, and passengers who look like me deserve crew members who don't need to be taught that we belong in first class. Mina Park, who'd been sitting quietly in the back of the media center, stood up. She wasn't technically credentialed press, but her live stream had started this entire chain of events, and the other journalists seemed to recognize her significance. Mr. Cross, I was on Flight 447. I filmed the incident and live streamed it. I've received thousands of messages from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination on airlines, and a lot of them are asking the same question: how do we know these reforms will actually happen? How do we know this isn't just good PR that will fade once the attention moves on? It was the question that mattered most, and Damien was glad someone had asked it directly. You hold me accountable, he said simply. The transparency reports I mentioned will be publicly available. Anyone can access them and verify whether we're following through. The Civil Rights Compliance Office will publish its findings and recommendations. The Scholarship Fund will have independent trustees who can confirm we're actually funding students and not just making empty promises. And most importantly, passengers and employees will continue to share their experiences. If discrimination continues, if we're not living up to these commitments, people will know, and I'll be held responsible. He paused, then added, but here's the thing, I want to be held responsible. I want passengers to expect better and complain loudly when we fail to deliver. I want employees to speak up when they witness discrimination instead of staying silent because nothing ever changes. The accountability isn't a burden I'm reluctantly accepting. It's the mechanism that ensures these reforms actually work. A woman from the Washington Post asked the final question. Mr. Cross, what do you say to other companies, other industries that face similar discrimination problems? What lessons can be drawn from what you're doing here? Damien considered the question carefully before responding. I'd say that discrimination doesn't fix itself. It doesn't gradually improve through natural evolution or good intentions. It persists because people with power benefit from the status quo, and people without power lack mechanisms to demand change. If you're a business leader and you're seeing discrimination in your organization, you have a choice. You can minimize it, explain it away, implement token changes that don't threaten anyone's comfort, or you can actually dismantle the systems that allow it to flourish. He leaned forward, his intensity palpable. The second path is harder. It costs money. It creates conflict. It requires admitting that your organization has failed people it should have protected. But it's also the only path that leads somewhere worth going. Because at the end of the day, business success that comes at the cost of human dignity isn't real success. It's just exploitation with better marketing. The press conference concluded shortly after, reporters rushing to file stories while Damien fielded a few more informal questions from journalists who wanted additional context. By 6:30, the media center was empty except for Damien, Lauren, Sharon, and Marcus, the four of them standing in the sudden silence like survivors of a storm. "That went better than I expected," Lauren said, checking her phone where news alerts were already popping up. CNN's headline is Airline CEO Vows Systemic Reform After Discrimination Incident. The New York Times is leading with your quote about power and accountability. This is actually good coverage. It's honest coverage, Damien corrected. We told the truth and people responded to that. Now comes the hard part, actually doing everything we promised. Sharon's phone rang, and she stepped away to take the call, returning a moment later with an odd expression. That was Terrence Morrison, the pharmaceutical sales rep whose grandmother you met yesterday. He wants to share his experiences with discrimination on our flights, and he said he knows at least 20 other frequent flyers who have similar stories. Set up meetings with all of them, Damien said immediately. I want to hear directly from passengers who've experienced what I experienced, not filtered through complaint forms or HR summaries, their actual stories in their own words. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. Mr. Cross, I've been talking to some of the ground staff and crew members who've been following this story. There's a lot of support for what you're doing, but there's also some resistance. People who think you're overreacting, who are worried about the new scrutiny, who feel like they're being blamed for systemic problems they didn't create. They're right to feel that way, Damien said. Not about me overreacting. I'm reacting exactly appropriately to a serious problem. But they're right that systemic problems aren't the fault of individual employees. That's why the reforms focus on changing structures and providing better training rather than just punishing people. We're not trying to make everyone feel guilty. We're trying to build systems that make discrimination harder to perpetrate and easier to identify. He checked his watch, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that had been building for 2 days straight. Lauren, can you start drafting the legal frameworks we'll need for the complaint review process? Sharon, I want you to identify the most experienced trainers in implicit bias work. I don't care what they cost, I want the best. Marcus, can you help me set up meetings with the ground staff and crew members who want to talk? They dispersed to handle their assignments, leaving Damien alone in the media center with his thoughts and the weight of promises that would require years to fulfill completely. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Watch the press conference. Your father would be so proud. I'm proud. Come home when you can. The pot roast is waiting. He smiled, feeling some of the tension drain away. The work wasn't finished. It would never really be finished, because building equitable systems required constant vigilance and adjustment. But the foundation had been laid. The accountability had been established. The message had been sent. 3 days later, Damien stood in the same LAX terminal where he'd confronted Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart, but this time he was there for a different reason. The first cohort of employees was gathering for the inaugural implicit bias training session. 60 flight attendants and gate agents who'd been selected for their influence and respect among their peers. If the training worked with them, they'd become ambassadors for the program throughout the airline. The training facility was a converted conference space that Transcontinental had hastily repurposed, with comfortable seating arranged in a circle rather than traditional classroom rows, facilitators who specialized in aviation industry discrimination rather than generic corporate consultants, and materials that had been reviewed and approved by civil rights organizations. Damien wasn't scheduled to attend. The training was designed to be a safe space where employees could explore their biases without fear of executive judgment. But he wanted to be present for the introduction, to show that leadership was invested in this work. When he entered the room, conversation died as 60 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness to open hostility. One flight attendant, an older white woman whose name tag read Barbara, crossed her arms defensively. Mr. Cross, she said, her voice carrying challenge, are we here because we're all racists who need to be fixed? The bluntness of the question caught several people off guard, But Damien appreciated the honesty. "No," he said simply. "You're here because we all operate with biases we've never examined, and those biases affect how we treat passengers. Some of you may have discriminated actively and consciously. Most of you probably haven't, but all of us have participated in a culture that allowed discrimination to flourish, and all of us have a responsibility to do better." He walked to the center of the circle, making himself vulnerable by standing exposed rather than hiding behind a podium or position. "I'm not here to lecture you or make you feel guilty. I'm here to tell you that what happened to me on Flight 447 wasn't an anomaly. It was predictable given the training and accountability systems we've had in place. And I'm committed to changing those systems so that you have the tools and support to treat every passenger with dignity." A younger black flight attendant raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Cross, some of us have been trying to speak up about discrimination for years, and we've been shut down or ignored. How do we know this time is different?" "Because this time, the person who got discriminated against owns the airline," Damien said with grim honesty. "And because I'm making my reputation dependent on following through. If these reforms fail, if discrimination continues, that failure is mine to own. That's not perfect accountability. Perfect accountability would mean everyone always does the right thing regardless of consequences. But it's better than what we had before." He looked around the circle, meeting as many eyes as would hold his gaze. "I want you to know something. What happened with Kylie Barnes and Gavin Hart was necessary, but it doesn't mean I think they're monsters, or that I took pleasure in ending their careers. I think they're people who operated with biases they'd never examined, in a system that didn't require them to examine those biases. They made choices that harmed me and other passengers, and there had to be consequences for those choices. But the goal isn't punishment, it's prevention. We're here today to build something better." Barbara, the skeptical flight attendant, studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, I'll give this a chance, but Mr. Cross, if this ends up being corporate theater where we sit through training and nothing actually changes, people are going to lose whatever faith you're building today." "Fair enough," Damien said, "and if that happens, I expect you to be the first person calling me out." He left them to their training, trusting the facilitators to guide them through difficult conversations about implicit bias, racial profiling, and the specific mechanisms of discrimination in airline contexts. As he walked back through the terminal, he saw passengers moving through their days with no idea that in a conference room nearby, the culture that would shape their future experiences was being rebuilt from scratch. Over the following months, the reforms rolled out with the intensity and focus that Damien had promised. Every customer-facing employee went through the training, some embracing it enthusiastically, others completing it grudgingly, but completing it nonetheless. The Civil Rights Compliance Office handled its first cases, investigating complaints and, in several instances, recommending terminations that were carried out swiftly and publicly. The transparency report showed complaint statistics, outcomes, and patterns, providing hard data that contradicted claims that discrimination was rare or exaggerated. The scholarship fund awarded its first 20 grants to students pursuing careers in aviation, young people of color who'd never imagined they could afford flight school or aviation management programs. Advisory board meetings brought civil rights advocates into direct conversation with airline executives, creating accountability mechanisms that had never existed before. There were setbacks. Some experienced employees quit rather than adapt to new expectations. A few union grievances had to be resolved through arbitration. Media attention eventually moved on to other stories, and Damien had to work to maintain focus and urgency when discrimination wasn't dominating news cycles. But there were victories too. Passenger complaint rates dropped by 40% in the first 6 months. Employee satisfaction surveys showed increased morale among workers of color who felt their concerns were finally being heard. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, the culture began to shift, not perfectly, not universally, but measurably. Passengers who might have been profiled before found themselves treated with dignity. Employees who witnessed discrimination spoke up instead of staying silent. Problems that once would have been buried in bureaucracy got addressed quickly and transparently. 6 months after Flight 447, Damien flew from Chicago to Los Angeles again, choosing the same route, the same first-class cabin, wanting to experience whether anything had actually changed. The flight attendant who greeted him at the door, a young Latina woman named Sofia, welcomed him aboard with professional warmth that showed no hint of surprise at seeing a black passenger in first class. She confirmed his seat assignment without scrutinizing his boarding pass, offered him a beverage with genuine courtesy, and throughout the flight treated every passenger with the same attentive respect regardless of their appearance or perceived status. It was, Damien reflected, the most unremarkable first-class experience he'd ever had, and that unremarkability felt like victory. When the plane landed at LAX, he walked through the same terminal where he'd confronted accountability 6 months ago, and this time several employees recognized him and nodded respectfully. Sharon Ortega was waiting at the gate, a tablet in hand showing the latest quarterly transparency report. "Complaint rates are down another 15% this quarter," she said, walking alongside him. "The training completion rate is 98% across all hubs, and we've only had to terminate 3 additional employees for discrimination violations. The advisory board says we're ahead of schedule on implementation milestones." "That's good," Damien said. "What about the passenger review process? How many historical complaints have we addressed?" 83 so far. We've provided compensation in 62 cases where we determined discrimination occurred. Several of those passengers have told us they're planning to fly with us again, which is remarkable considering their previous experiences. They reached the operations center where Damien's next meetings were scheduled, continuing work on the reforms, addressing challenges as they emerged, making adjustments based on what the data showed was working and what needed refinement. The work was never finished, would never be finished, because building equitable systems required constant attention and evolution. But as Damien settled into the conference room with Sharon, Marcus, Lauren, and the growing team of people committed to this work, he felt something he hadn't felt on Flight 447. Not satisfaction exactly, not completion, but the solid certainty of meaningful progress. They'd taken a moment of humiliation and transformed it into structural change. They'd converted viral outrage into lasting accountability. And across the country, in airports and on airplanes, passengers of color were boarding flights with slightly less anxiety, slightly more confidence that they'd be treated with dignity. Employees were speaking up when they witnessed discrimination, knowing their voices mattered. Young people were pursuing aviation careers they'd never thought possible because a scholarship fund existed to support them. None of it was perfect. All of it was necessary. And the distance between Flight 447's humiliation and today's ordinary respect measured exactly how far commitment and accountability could move systems that had seemed immovable. Damien's phone buzzed with a message from Mina Park, the travel blogger whose live stream had started everything. "Hey, Mr. Cross, just flew transcontinental for the first time since that day. Crew was great, felt safe, and respected the whole flight. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Thanks for not letting this fade away." He smiled and typed back, "Thank you for filming. Documentation matters. Witnesses matter. Keep holding us accountable." Because that, ultimately, was the lesson of Flight 447. Not that one man with power could fix discrimination through sheer force of will, but that documentation, accountability, persistent commitment, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths could begin to reshape cultures that had accepted injustice as inevitable. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, golden light streaming through the operations center windows, as Damien opened his laptop and began reviewing the next quarter's implementation plans. Outside, planes continued their eternal rhythm of arrival and departure, carrying passengers who had no idea that the dignity with which they'd be treated had been fought for, systematically built, and maintained through daily choices to prioritize humanity over convenience. And somewhere in the country, another black passenger was boarding a first-class flight, settling into a seat they'd paid for, and experiencing the unremarkable courtesy that should always have been their right. That passenger would never know about Flight 447, would never hear about Kylie Barnes or Clayton Reed or the emergency board meetings and press conferences and months of difficult reform work. But they would benefit from it anyway. That was how systemic change worked. Not through individual heroism or viral moments, but through the patient, unglamorous work of building better structures and then maintaining them when attention moved elsewhere. Damien Cross, CEO of Crosswell Group and majority owner of Transcontinental Airways, had learned that lesson through humiliation. Now he was teaching it through example, one reform at a time, one employee at a time, one flight at a time. And the work continued, as it always would, because dignity was never a destination you reached and then stopped pursuing. It was a commitment you renewed with every choice, every policy, every moment when you had to decide whether convenience or humanity mattered more. In the end, Damien had decided, and that decision, multiplied across an entire airline, had proven that change was possible when those with power finally chose to wield it on behalf of those without. The story of Flight 447 didn't end with accountability. It began there, transforming a moment of discrimination into a blueprint for lasting reform that would echo through countless flights, countless passengers, countless moments when dignity was protected instead of violated. That was justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real and measurable, and worth every difficult conversation, every uncomfortable reform, every hour spent building something better than what had come before. And as the sun disappeared below the Los Angeles horizon and the work continued in conference rooms and training facilities and aircraft cabins across the country, that justice kept expanding, one respectful interaction at a time, one protected passenger at a time, one choice for dignity at a time. The transformation was complete, and it was only just beginning.